Chapter 365. The trolls who were almost at the top of the tree silently readied their weapons. Most of them revealed their sharp triangular teeth, revealing a sinister smile. This was a grudge that had lasted for thousands of years. To the trolls, ever since this pale-skinned, pointy-eared intruder first set foot on this continent 6,800 years ago, they had been stealing territory from the great Amani Empire. They gradually seized control of this land. They had the speed, stealthiness, and even agility of trolls. These elves also had many powerful advantages, the most powerful of which was their damned magic. The trolls had never come into contact with magic before, so they had no way of fighting back against those mysterious attacks or breaking through their arcane defenses. The only thing they could do was to use their high-speed regeneration of flesh and blood, their advantage in numbers, and their lives to suppress these hateful elves. The trolls had once succeeded. Their ancestors had used their blood to create epic troll weapons, using up the last drop of magic in the elven bloodline, and almost completely annihilated these weak fellows. But 2,000 years ago, the elves and the despicable humans formed an alliance. These two pale-skinned races completely destroyed the Amani Empire. They took down fortresses, burned castles, burned the Amani Empire's cultural essence to the ground, and slaughtered tens of thousands of their fellow trolls. The once ruler of the planet, the great Amani Empire, was shattered, and no longer had its former glory. All that was left was the shadow of thousands of years of continuous defeats, like maggots in a bone, entangling the souls of every troll. The trolls were no longer able to restore their glory and take back everything that belonged to them. Until now, the appearance of the horde gave them hope for revenge. Zhu Jin was willing to believe in them. Orgrim Doomhammer, a bold and wise leader of the horde, promised to help them rebuild the Amani Empire. In fact, when the humans and orcs started the war, Zhu Jin had tried to reunite the trolls of the various tribes. Amani, Fire Tree, Rotten Moss, Evil Tooth, Evil Branch, Burning Bramble, Deadwood. These forest troll tribes that had been divided for countless generations, and had long become enemies and hated each other, had for the first time found common ground in the face of a greater and more glorious goal. One by one, Zhu Jin challenged and defeated the leaders of these clans, whether it was through battles, competitions, or something else. All of them had already knelt before him. They and their tribes would all listen to his commands. The forest trolls banded together once more. Apart from that, the Frostmane clan and the other Frost Troll clans that had lost their territories to the Bronzebeard dwarves had also joined the army of revenge. With the help of the tribe, they would clean up the world in a similar way as the humans and elves, and then regain control of the forest. The orcs showed no interest in the forest at all. Zhu Jin suspected that they would occupy the valleys and plains of this world. Let the orcs go, but the trolls only wanted the forest. Standing on the tree, Zhu Jin's sinister smile widened as he looked down at the elves who didn't know that they had stepped into the gates of hell. Zhu Jin, who had also grown up immersed in the mud of hatred and revenge, completely understood the feelings of his compatriots. They had already infiltrated deep into the elves' homeland and were preparing to slaughter the elves on the land that they had stolen from their hands, the land that the elves believed to be their homeland and incomparably safe. Let the elves taste the feeling of losing their homes and being slaughtered. Suddenly, the sound of wind breaking overhead alerted some of the patrolling elves. It was already too late. The trolls weren't known for their strength, but that was relative to the orcs. In this environment where they would have to fight at close quarters in less than 2 seconds, the weakness of the elves' lack of individual combat ability was magnified many times over. Zhu Jin jumped down from the tree, and his huge feet landed right on top of the heads of 2 elves. The huge weight and the acceleration of gravity easily broke the necks of the 2 elves. Before his feet even touched the ground of the forest, Zhu Jin threw out his axe with a strange technique. The sharp giant axe, spinning in midair, easily flew between the 2 elves. Before they could react, the spinning blade of the axe had already sliced open the throat of the elf who was facing Zhu Jin. In less than half a second, the axe cut deeply into the head of the elf who was slightly further back. The other axe did the same. The speed at which it fell was almost as fast as the 2 elves who had been trampled to death by Zhu Jin. The remaining 4 elves lost their lives and collapsed, their blood splattering on the leaves of the forest grass. It was a ghastly sight. Before they could even scream, the rest of the elves were also taken care of by the trolls who descended from the sky like lightning. Zhu Jin was very satisfied with this ambush that was like an appetizer. Cut off their heads and hang them up. If there's a chance, tell the elves that the trolls are coming. On all fronts in the southern part of the Long Song forest, the trolls attacked the elven patrols in a frenzy. Some troll armies easily won, while others paid a heavy price. What? You're saying that some of the elves predicted our arrival and made arrangements to surround and kill us? Zhu Jin was very confused by his subordinate's report. If this was a battle where the trolls were warned from above, then the trolls' losses would undoubtedly be much greater. Unfortunately, the trolls only suffered a crushing defeat in less than a fifth of the area. The rest were overwhelming victories. Whatever, we'll leave the rest to the orcs. Let's see if Orgrim can break through those damned elven defensive spells like he promised. What are you doing? When Dan approached Orgrim, the great chief barked out a warning question. There are some things that you should see for yourself, Great Doomhammer. Dan bowed deeply. Orgrim nodded and put the hammer on his shoulder, indicating for Dan to lead the way. Dan turned around and led Doomhammer and his personal guards back. Soon, they arrived in front of a large pit that had been dug out. At the bottom of the pit was a large stone, and the rough surface of the stone had countless intricate runes drawn on it. Those strokes were definitely the work of a clever creature. But that wasn't the point. Even someone like Doomhammer, who knew nothing about mystical abilities and spiritual power, could feel the energy emanating from this heavy stone. This is the elven trap? Orgrim asked. Yes, and it's not just a trap. Chapter 366. Dan stroked his beard and replied, "This thing is filled with energy. I believe that these runestones and the other runestones at the edge of the forest are evenly distributed here, forming a large magic trap and barrier." What barrier? They didn't stop us or cause any damage, Orgrim pointed out. No, because we're only using our bodies to enter the forest and use normal weapons, Dan replied. I believe that these runestones restrict the use of magic. It's very likely that only the elves can cast their spells in this area. I've tried to cast some spells here before, but they all failed. If I retreat 10 steps to the other side of the mountain, I can cast spells again. Orgrim was solemn. This was no laughing matter. He clearly remembered how destructive human magic was. If it wasn't for the Beastmen warlocks suppressing the human mages, the Beastmen would have had to pay a heavy price to defeat the humans. This was why he didn't exterminate the Shadow Council that he hated so much. Human magic originated from the elves. He knew how powerful Dan was. Even after he was injured, Dan's magic was still the strongest among the Beastmen. The battle against the human's strongest mage, Antonidas, in South Shore proved Dan's strength. Yet Dan told himself that his magic couldn't be used. What about the trap? It seems to be able to draw out the powerful force hidden in the forest, as long as those long ears want it. Boom! Dan grinned, his mouth making sounds as if he was about to explode. How many can it deal with at once? Dan laughed sinisterly as he raised 5 fingers. 5,000? Orgrim probed. 50,000, and as long as it's within the range of the rune, as long as it's densely packed, killing 10,000 trolls isn't a problem. The great chief immediately recalled the day Stormwind City was conquered, where thousands of Beastman warriors were burned to death in the flames. Even though the Blackrock tribe Beastmen had a certain level of fire resistance, they weren't immune to fire. If the fire was big enough, they would still be injured and die. After Orgrim knew the answer, he jumped in fright and simply raised his hammer. His meaning was very clear. Is there any way to destroy it? No, this is too wasteful. I can turn it into a storm altar and use the power of the runestone to strengthen creatures. Dan's hunchbacked body gave off an evil aura. No orcs will participate in your strengthening, the great chieftain refused sharply. They have indeed become stronger. Orgrim stared at Ghoul Dan, his eyes filled with killing intent. Stronger, greener, less intelligent, and more violent. Ghoul Dan lowered his head. He did not plan to openly oppose the great chief at this time. I plan to strengthen the ogres. Perhaps there will be some changes in their bodies. But that has nothing to do with the orcs. It had nothing to do with him, so he let it go. Feeling that the loss of the tribe's elites would cause their fighting power to drop, Orgrim agreed. Just like how he agreed to let the dead humans become Death Knights to join the tribe. The preparations went smoothly and took a lot of time. Initially, Orgrim thought that Zhu Jin would be impatient. Unexpectedly, Zhu Jin said, "My ancestors spent hundreds of years and still couldn't break this barrier. I don't mind waiting a few days or months as long as I can break it. The trolls can wait." After saying this, Zhu Jin ran off to kill the elven patrols outside. After Ghoul Dan used his evil dark magic and rituals to break the outermost layer of the runestone's protection, he ordered Google, the twin-headed ogre hero, to carefully and orderly dismantle this giant runestone. This was a highly skilled and physically demanding job. If he used brute force to dismantle it, the result would be obvious. A certain clumsy ogre activated the protection on the runestone, but what happened? The unlucky ogre was blasted 30 meters into the air. Then, his entire body broke into tens of thousands of pieces that were evenly scattered over an area of 100 square meters. Even if the ogre's mother came here, she would not be able to recognize that this was her child. It took them a full 8 hours to completely dig out this runestone. Fortunately, Orgrim had brought some elites and the trolls as the vanguard here first. Otherwise, he could only let the army of 100,000 wait. Now, the army of 100,000 was still advancing 60 kilometers away. On the other side, Google skillfully smashed the giant runestone into a few large pieces. He brought 5 of the pieces to the clearing and spent a few more hours correcting the shape of the runestone. He placed it in the correct shape of a 5-pointed star on the clearing above the energy vein of the forest. "Is everything ready?" Ghoul Dan asked impatiently. Not far away, both of Google's heads shook their heads. The giant ogre grunted like a pig. He carried the last piece of the runestone, which weighed at least 5 tons, with his strong and explosive arms. "It's done now," he shouted, rubbing his shoulder with one hand. Ghoul Dan finally nodded in satisfaction. He could not imagine how he would handle the runestone, which was the size of a small mountain, without enough manpower. The runestone was huge, heavy, and had a strange center of gravity deviation. 2 ogres could lift it, but it would require at least a dozen orcs to do it. Orgrim hated magic, and would never let the noble orcs do such a dangerous thing. Fortunately, the great chief allowed Ghoul Dan to use some ogres to do it, and Google could command his stupid one-headed orcs more easily than any other orc. Yes, when faced with a bunch of muscular retards, it did not matter if you were a world-class intellectual or not, you would still go crazy. Ghoul Dan could calculate how the elves moved the runestones to their original positions the first time. That had nothing to do with magic. Magic was powerful, but compared to the energy needed to lift 100 kilograms of weight with magic, it was better to use slaves. Forest trolls were about as strong as ogres, but they were much smarter, and they would listen to specific commands. However, the elves did not have the habit of keeping forest troll slaves for long periods of time. The runestone was finally placed in the correct position. Even Ghoul Dan could not find any fault with it. Ghoul Dan waved his hand, and the 5 orc warlocks each chose one of the runestone and stood beside it. Fortunately, Orgrim's brain is only filled with schemes and muscles, and he did not kill all of my men. Otherwise, they would not have been able to complete this ritual. Chapter 367. Just like before, while Ghoul Dan believed that he would succeed, he wasn't completely sure. However, as an evil warlock with an unparalleled spirit of exploration, there was nothing he couldn't sacrifice. Furthermore, Ghoul Dan believed that if he failed, he would survive unscathed. Let's begin. He nodded to Kurger, who was shouting at the assembled ogres. He was recruiting lab rats. After some pushing and shoving, grunting, and cursing, the weakest of the ogres walked forward. Of course, no matter how weak he was still several times heavier and twice as tall as a human. Google shouted an order at the ogre. The ogre looked like he was ready to die a martyr, shrugging his shoulders as he walked into the empty space in the middle of the stones. He stood in the middle of the pentagram and waited, not moving. One of the strengths of the ogres was that they would stand firmly after being asked to. If not for another order or to find food, an ogre could stand there for hours, not moving an inch like a marble statue. Ghoul Dan often felt that these fellows had evolved from stones. This could also explain their thick skin that could easily block blades, as well as their ridiculously low intelligence. If Ghoul Dan ordered them to move forward, they would first spend a few seconds thinking about their demon life, perhaps thinking about the human delicacy they ate the night before drooling. Then, they would randomly choose a direction to move forward, killing everything they didn't like along the way. Sometimes, this included their own kind or their master. If he had a choice, Ghoul Dan definitely wouldn't order these idiots around without Google Dan's permission. With Google around, at least these idiots would walk in the right direction, and they wouldn't have to worry about hurting their own people. Of course, efficiency was still a mystery. Sometimes they could contemplate life while being stabbed in the thigh with a knife. Only with the twin-headed ogre around would their efficiency reach a passable standard. Ghoul Dan's thoughts returned to the present. He raised his arm and began to resonate with the dark energy that the Burning Legion's vice leader, Kill Jaden, had bestowed upon him in Draenor. The evil power tore through the plane and crossed through space, pouring into Ghoul Dan's body. As a medium, he immediately split it into 5, sending it to the soul crystals in front of the 5 warlocks' chests, and then into the rune stones in front of them. The stench, decay, and depravity were corroding the arcana power that originated from nature. This was not without cost. The origin of nature instinctively resisted the corrosion and invasion. A dazzling radiance burst forth from the depths of the earth and was directly transmitted to the runestone. The energy visible to the naked eye fiercely attacked the 5 warlocks who attempted to pollute the runestone. The power of the counterattack was so violent that the skull staff of the warlock standing in the south cracked on the spot. Less than half a second after the stench and filthy death aura flowed out, the power of the earth seemed to have found a vent and suddenly attacked the warlock. Woo! The unlucky ones with insufficient strength were always the first to suffer. The power of nature crashed into that guy's body like a raging wave. One could see that there were unknown plants growing out of every pore on his arms. Trash! Ghoul Dan spat. Without needing his reminder, Gujar grabbed the dead warlock and took his place. 3 seconds later, Ghoul Dan had to do the same thing as the 2-headed ogre magician. This helpless feeling of having to personally take the field made Ghoul Dan very unhappy. Fortunately, the remaining 3 fellas were clearly a cut above the 2 dead men from before. Now, the 5 pharaoh each chose a stone in front of them and poured dark energy into it. When all the rune lines on the 5 runestones were filled with black light and vibrated, Ghoul Dan focused his mind and chanted a short incantation. Every note of the evil spell contained a taboo smell of blood, which made Orgrim, who was watching from the side, very uncomfortable. The great tribal chief frowned. Unfortunately, he had no other choice. Shamans were not good at breaking through enemies' magic defenses, and the only powerful shaman under him was Zuluhid, whose strength was clearly 2 levels lower than Ghoul Dan's. More dark energy flowed through Ghoul Dan's wrinkled skin and into his runestone from his scarlet fingertips. But this time, it wasn't just a simple injection of energy. The overflowing demonic aura turned into a black comet, passing through the stone on his left at high speed before jumping towards the stone on his right. The demon's power did not stop there. It continued to move to the near left, then to the far right, and finally returned to the stone in front of him. A glowing pentagram connected all 5 stones. Wherever the black comet passed, it would quickly turn black. There would no longer be any signs of life. Countless complicated runes would appear on the ground. In the next moment, the sky above the altar suddenly darkened. The corrosive energy shot thousands of meters into the air before exploding. Soon, a strange storm appeared in the sky. It was made up of a white tornado that moved clockwise and a black tornado that moved counterclockwise. The storm stretched from the ground to thousands of meters in the sky, and could be seen clearly from hundreds of miles away. This terrifying storm alarmed the entire area. All the high elves who were fighting the trolls were alarmed. The ogre in the pentagram was still like a statue, standing there stiffly, even though Dan could see the clear fear in that fellow's eyes. Unfortunately, he was facing Google. A natural two-headed ogre, the absolute ruler of the ogres. No matter how afraid he was, even if Google wanted him to die, he had to obey. Very good. Google chose a good guy. Dan grinned evilly. The power of the earth resonated with the sky. The power of the magic runestone was directed by Dan to the ogre standing in the middle. He wasn't trembling, but his heart was trembling. A black halo enveloped him. At first, it was one circle, then countless circles. The black energy seemed to solidify as it poured onto the ogre's body. More and more energy poured onto him, finally forming a huge black sphere. The entire ogre was swallowed by this impenetrable black sphere. The immeasurable dark energy turned into a black storm, drilling into the ogre's body through every pore. The ogre finally couldn't help but scream. Moments later, the screams doubled. Two heads were screaming at the same time. Chapter 368. Dan was trembling, but he was trembling in excitement from this new creation. A few minutes later, as the light gradually dissipated, the creature standing in the middle slowly revealed its true appearance. Dan eagerly waited for the light to fade so that he could see the creature that his storm altar had created. There was still an ogre standing in front of them, but there were some changes to this creature. Although it was larger than before, some of its proportions had changed. Its stomach was not as large, its arms were not as long, and its legs were not as curved, making it more agile. It also had two heads. This was definitely an unexpected surprise. No one knew better than Dan what a twin-headed ogre represented. In Draenor, twin-headed ogres were very rare. They were larger and stronger than their own kind, and more coordinated. They were worshipped by all single-headed ogres and were recognized as the supreme kings of the ogres. Google was one of them. No, he was even rarer. He was proven to have enough intelligence to be a mage. Dan had found this twin-headed ogre when he was still young and trained him very seriously. Google was a reliable assistant and a powerful warlock, and he had accompanied Dan to this day. Now, it seemed that Google was no longer alone. A twin-headed ogre. And it was clear that he had high intelligence and coordination. Most importantly, this kind of ogre mage with two heads was born with the talent of casting multiple spells. He could maintain his powerful close combat abilities while also casting unparalleled spells. The power that came from the source allowed the twin-headed ogre mage to quickly recognize Dan as his master. Then, Dan had Google explain to him everything he needed to know about the horde. The ogre mage listened quietly, absorbing everything like a sponge absorbing water. The birth of this mage was definitely good news for Dan, who lacked soldiers. Of course, to Orgrim, these were larger and more powerful warriors. The great chief did not care that these new creatures were completely loyal to Dan and not him. For a horde with such a large population, twin-headed ogres and ogre mages were just a small part of it. As long as he controlled the entire tribe, no matter what kind of thoughts the people under him had, they had to serve the tribe. Orgrim smiled and turned to leave. Because Dan would complete the rest of the work, the great chief did not care how many twin-headed ogres this power could create. Orgrim's focus had always been on the bigger picture, such as the complete loyalty of the trolls. However, an accident interrupted his good mood. Something happened to Zujin. It was a premeditated ambush, a sharp arrow that almost pierced Zujin's heart. This almost ruined Orgrim's plan to bring the trolls into the new horde. Seeing the familiar emerald arrow on Zhu Jin's chest, Orgrim raised his eyebrows. Just a centimeter more and Zhu Jin's heart would have exploded. The entire arrow, over 60 centimeters long, pierced through Zhu Jin's body. Moreover, the strange power contained within the arrow refused the ogre's healing ability. To make matters worse, Zuluhid told the great chief that pulling it out by force might cost Zhu Jin's life. Orgrim was very clear of Zhu Jin's importance. Since the other troll tribes had just submitted to him and had yet to complete the alliance between the beastmen and trolls, Zhu Jin, who was equivalent to the great chief of the trolls, was indispensable. Orgrim gritted his teeth and said in a low voice, "Who did it? Aurelia? Or Servanas?" Orgrim could not remember every enemy's name, but the most outstanding ones could not be ignored. "I don't know. There were 3 very powerful female elven rangers who looked very similar to me." Zhu Jin gritted his teeth and replied, "More accurately, there were 4 of them, but the last one was slightly weaker." 3. 4. Of course, Orgrim did not know about the Windrunner sisters. Just like how it was difficult for him to differentiate between different races. Face blindness after crossing races was a common case. "Rest well, the tribe will avenge you," Orgrim comforted Zhu Jin. From what he saw, Zhu Jin would need a lot of time to get rid of the mysterious green power. Who knew that Zhu Jin would suddenly pull him back? "I saw the changes of the times, and I saw how insignificant I am. So I need power. Power of magic. Mysterious power. I heard that you used the elven runestones to make an altar." Gul'dan's altar. Orgrim had never been too interested in Gul'dan's evil magic, so he had to remind Zhu Jin, "The latest news is that out of every 10 ogres, 3 will die during the ritual, 6 will become 2-headed ogres during the ritual, and only 1 will truly obtain the power of magic." Zhu Jin coughed out some green blood. "Isn't it just a chance to die, grow another head, or become a deformed monster? For the sake of the troll's revenge, I have nothing to fear." Orgrim looked down on this kind of personal hatred, but he was moved by the sacrifice of the entire race. Zhu Jin wanted to sacrifice himself or pay some other price to obtain this kind of ethereal evil power. This was also a kind of honor. Orgrim did not refuse. "When you think it is appropriate, Gul'dan will perform the ritual for you." When Gul'dan heard this news, he grinned in joy. "Perhaps I can truly control a great demon chieftain." An hour later, the storm altar was fully activated again. The power drawn from the sky was modified by the runestones, turning into dense dark energy that accurately hit the Troll King's chest. The dark evil aura wrapped around the green arrow in Zhu Jin's chest. Under the tearing of this level of terrifying power, the green energy that seemed to have formed an endless cycle was easily crushed and devoured by the darkness. A large bloody hole appeared in Zhu Jin's chest. The ritual was not over yet. Getting rid of the power that Windrunner had left in Zhu Jin's chest was only the first step. When the other runestones poured more dark energy into Zhu Jin's body, the Troll King's chest began to swell up. It was not just his chest. Almost every inch of Zhu Jin's body, from his neck to his shoulders, to his arms, to his waist, to his thighs, was swelling up. More demonic power entered the wound on Zhu Jin's chest. The wriggling bloody wound was like a huge and ferocious mouth, as if it was devouring the dark energy. Finally, a gust of dark wind burst out of Zhu Jin's body. Chapter 369. Young man, do you want to be a magical girl? Oh. No, Zhu Jin, do you want to be a magic troll? Trolls were actually quite adaptable. Apart from paladins, trolls could advance into almost any profession. Considering that trolls also had the bloodthirst talent of minor berserk, it was generally agreed that trolls should be hunters. Of course, for heroes, the definition of professions was very vague. Just like Zhu Jin, he was a warrior, but he had the agility of a thief. Now, with the infusion of power from the storm altar, Zhu Jin had awakened a new profession, druid. Roar dash, this was the roar of a giant bear. The image of a giant dark bear that was as large as a small hill appeared on Zhu Jin's back. All of the observing giant demons shuddered. Next, there was a clear cry of an eagle. The giant bear image turned into a giant eagle image with gray-brown feathers and a wingspan of over 100 meters. Zhu Jin greedily absorbed the energy of the world, but at this moment, Gul Dan's expression was not good. Zhu Jin's nature power was rejecting the darkness power from entering. Gul Dan could clearly feel that Zhu Jin was merging the darkness power into his berserk bloodline. Because of the boiling blood, it weakened the darkness power. The biggest problem was that the darkness power conflicted with Zhu Jin's awakened talent. If he forcefully injected the darkness power, Zhu Jin would explode and die. Orgrim was staring at Gul Dan. Zhu Jin's subordinates were also staring at Gul Dan. For power, Zhu Jin did not fear death. But could Gul Dan let Zhu Jin die now? They had not even fought a proper battle against the elves, and Zhu Jin, the only one who could control the trolls, was going to die. Regardless of whether Orgrim would let Gul Dan go, the other trolls would be the first to not let him go. The trolls might even fight with the beast men right in front of the elves. That would not be worth it. Tisk. Gul Dan lightly spat, Nagitaloka Saxi. He chanted an incantation, dispelling the darkness power on the runestone. Even though it was still the power of the demon that controlled the runestone, what was being transferred to Zhu Jin was the purer nature power. Zhu Jin's body stopped expanding. It had expanded to its limit, and the blood vessels that were about to explode finally had the space to shrink back. Zhu Jin's eyes suddenly widened, and a terrifying divine light burst out from his fierce and lifelike eyes. I feel power, the power of the great bear and the eagle. It is the power of the earth, it is the power of the sky. Zhu Jin's entire body was suddenly wrapped in green light. In just half a second, Zhu Jin had turned into a huge eagle. It flapped its gigantic wings that were more than 5 meters long on one side, stirring up more than 10 tornadoes on its wings, easily blowing away all the leaves on the towering trees on the periphery of the clearing. The bare tree trunk stood out in the lush and luxuriant forest in the summer. In the next moment, Zhu Jin's body began to shrink again. It wasn't that his power had weakened, but that his power had become more condensed. It was like a retracted fist. Only when it attacked would the effect be even more frightening. Walking down the altar with large strides, Zhu Jin appeared to be even more powerful and spirited. Walking proudly in front of Orgrim, Zhu Jin knelt down on one knee for the first time. Even though the posture was rather crude and unsightly, it was still a kneel. This symbolized the true acknowledgement and submission of the great demon to the orc tribe. Orgrim's chest heaved up and down rapidly. Why did he want to attack the elves from 1,000 miles away? Of course, he knew that the elves were also targets that the tribe had to conquer or destroy. After all, the elves hadn't officially joined the war yet. It wasn't wise to rashly let a powerful opponent join them. If there were additional allies that the orcs could easily accept, or even the loyalty of subordinate races, then it would be a good deal. Now, Orgrim's wait was finally here. Good. 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 Orgrim hurriedly helped Zhu Jin up. I said that the orcs and great demons are brothers. Frustrated that the attributes of the storm altar had changed again, Gul Dan had Gujar destroy the rune lines on the runestone and abandoned the altar. Deep into the night, not a single tribe was left. An altar that had lost its effectiveness was worthless. Just as the entire forest was shrouded in darkness, a few figures suddenly appeared near the altar. Despicable great demons. Despicable tribe, they actually destroyed the runestone. The one in front was Aurelia. As the eldest daughter of the Windrunner family and an elf who loved this land, she had always felt that it was her duty to protect it. She knelt down on one knee and inspected the runestone fragments around the altar, a pained expression on her face. The elf's safety barrier, a gigantic magical barrier that had been unbreakable for thousands of years, had been destroyed by Gul Dan. Just like that, Duque appeared beside Aurelia and gently pressed his hand on her shoulder. Tomorrow morning, bring the broken runestone to the Silver Moon Council, Aurelia immediately interrupted Duque. No. I'll go now. Let's see what those blind counselors have to say this time. The most famous Ranger General was filled with a towering rage. There's no rush. Unless Silvery Moon City is directly attacked, it would be troublesome to summon the counselors in the middle of the night. It's tomorrow morning anyway. Duque easily pacified Aurelia. Then what are we going to do tonight? The one speaking was Windsor Windrunner, the third sister of the Windrunner generation. In the original history, she was already the youngest female member of the family. It was a pity that there was still Lilith who was standing beside him. She was the youngest of them all. Did you think that my painstaking effort to get you to ambush Zhu Jin was a waste of effort? At the mention of Zhu Jin, the four Windrunner sisters gritted their teeth in hatred. In Duke's original plan, it would be best if he could directly destroy Zhu Jin. As the most important link between the beast men and great demons, Chief Orgrim was the most difficult to kill. On the other hand, Zhu Jin was completely defenseless. The current Zhu Jin was no longer the Amani tribe chief who had awakened new powers and caused havoc in Zul-Haman. Unfortunately, even if he found the four Windrunner sisters to work with him, he still could not take Zhu Jin's life. Duque's plan was always one ring after another. Knowing that Ghoul Dan had used the storm altar to strengthen a large number of ogres, Duque had an idea. After Zhu Jin suffered a setback, Zhu Jin would definitely seek greater power. However, Zhu Jin's attributes were incompatible with the storm altar. Chapter 370. In order to maintain control over the trolls, Great Chief Orgrim would definitely let Zhu Jin walk onto the altar, and he could not let Zhu Jin die on the altar. Now, Duque had made the right bet. Ghoul Dan had left early, leaving behind an altar that still had a lot of energy. While the runestone was still intact, Duque could not risk a group of elven girls going berserk and touch it. Furthermore, he did not have the skills to do so. When Ghoul Dan wanted to get the runestone, he did not have the ability to deal with a former demigod warlock, who was now a Breaking Dawn villain. Furthermore, Orgrim and the trolls' elites were all here. Just a few of them running over would be asking for death. Now, everything was different. Something stolen by an enemy would be taken by an ally. The rule of this world was that the ally was the new owner of the item. To return the item to its original owner, a corresponding price had to be paid. Even if the four Windrunner were here, they did not feel that Duque had done anything wrong. Duque bowed slightly, showing respect to one of the important figures behind him. Archbishop Fail, Uther, I'll have to trouble you. Ghoul Dan's sorcery was impossible to defend against. That unimaginable power was something that Duque did not want to touch unless he had no other choice. To purify evil, he needed professionals. For this, the prepared Duque had personally invited two gods from the Church of Holy Light, as well as a teleportation service. Archbishop Alonso's Fail smiled and nodded. Let me see. A moment later, Alonso smiled. The Ghoul Dan you speak of is indeed a very evil and powerful warlock. However, I discovered that he seemed to have some reservations and did not completely contaminate these runestones. The remaining curse is not too strong. I can get rid of it in a few minutes. Then I'll leave it to you, Archbishop. If possible, try not to cause too much of a commotion. Duque was definitely playing with fire. The Horde's vanguard was less than 30 kilometers from here, while the Horde's main force was 20 kilometers away. If he caused a commotion, the Horde's dragon knights would arrive in a moment. However, Duque had to seize the opportunity. The High Elves' runic magic circle was a complete defense system with 8 in a row. Apart from this one, Ghoul Dan had destroyed another 2, so the large amount of energy gathered by the rune stones would quickly dissipate due to the destruction of the rune stones. If he missed this opportunity, he wouldn't be able to find it. This was the only time he could take advantage of the High Elves. There were no other opportunities. In fact, these runestones were processed by countless elven mages and craftsmen over hundreds of years, and it took nearly 1,000 years for them to be completely calibrated. One could well imagine how precious it was. In just a few minutes, Fail had finished dispelling the evil magic. With a warm smile on his face, he said, "My job is very simple. On the other hand, restoring the runic lines embedded in it is a huge project." Duque sighed. "That's my problem." Without hesitation, he opened the portal and sent Fao and Uther away. If the great archbishop accidentally died in Cuel Salis because of Duque's risky plan, Duque would bet 50 cents that Lothar would definitely come after him. And then? Sylvanas put her hands on her hips. "Don't tell me, Duque, that you're going to spend 10 days to half a month here to rebuild these, rubble?" Queen Sylvanas actually wanted to say that they were powdered, completely destroyed runestone fragments. Each piece was not much bigger than a bean. Regardless of whether they could be put back together like a puzzle, even if they could be put back together, how effective would they be? At this moment, Duque was saying in his heart, "Hey, system elf, time to work." "Hey, my host, do you really know how to order people around?" Is there anyone? Where is he? Why don't I see him?" Duque looked around, but not in front of him. "Host, you've lost your integrity. You weren't like this before," the system elf said sharply. "Cut the crap and get to work." Duque glared. "All right." A series of system notifications popped up. "Begin scanning. Start analyzing the damaged shape of each runestone. Starting comparison. Hand of magic, activate." Under the astonished gazes of the few guys who followed him, more than 200 hands of magic quickly picked up the rubble of various sizes from the ground and then glued them together with special glue that had been prepared. Gavin Rad, who was next to him, rolled his eyes with his hammer, as if his boss wasn't human. The hands of magic flew at high speed, with all kinds of dazzling crisscrossing movements. At first, Sasha, who was the most curious of the Windrunner sisters, tried to follow the trajectory of Duque's hands of magic with her eyes. Unfortunately, Sasha quickly fainted. She looked like she was about to faint. Sasha took the opportunity to lean on her elder sister's shoulder and asked in a low voice, "Sis, is your boyfriend really a human?" Aurelia's face was full of embarrassment. Boyfriend? Aurelia hadn't really thought about this word. Although they both vaguely felt that it was the case, the last layer of thin veil was never revealed. Suddenly exposed by her own sister, Aurelia's face was burning. Admit it? Or not? That was a problem. Admit it? How much? That was also a problem. At this moment, Sylvanas abruptly helped her elder sister out of the situation. "Humph. You want to pick the most beautiful and mature flower of the Windrunner family? You'll have to ask us three sisters first." Sasha decisively joined in the fun. Aurelia looked at Sasha, the younger sister who looked similar to her but had bright silver hair, and had mixed feelings. She didn't know how to tell her sister that if they successfully saved Cuel Salis this time, she and Sylvanas would become Duque's vassals according to the agreement. There was a sense of reluctance to part, but also a sense of confusion that this seemed to be a good thing. While the three sisters were fooling around, Duque had finished reassembling the runestone. A completely 3D runestone pattern that had been magnified 10 times appeared in Duque's spiritual sea. After comparing Ghoul, Dan's storm altar array with the magic pattern on the runestone, the system finally came up with a result. It was the result of thousands of elven mages' calculations for hundreds of years. Just like how Duque reverse-deduced a complete spell from a simple magic model, he easily deduced how the complete storm altar system worked based on the leftover materials. Done. Duque raised his hand, and the runestone that had been reconstructed immediately disappeared in the wind. He turned to look at the rest of the runestone fragments. Using Gavinrad almost as a 3D printer, Duque held Gavinrad's arm with Hand of Magic and began to guide him in processing the fragments. After a whole hour, a brand new storm altar appeared in front of everyone. "Young man, do you desire power?" Duque asked Gavinrad absent-mindedly. Chapter 371. Huh. I already believe in the holy light, Gavinrad immediately replied. I'm not asking you to change your faith. I'm just asking if you're interested in mastering a new, stronger power, Duque replied seriously. I think I'm strong enough. Gavin Rad was a little skeptical about Duque's recommendation. Come on, I'm not saying that the power of the holy light isn't good, but the power of the holy light lies in the piety of the heart. Your piety is only slightly above average. So even if your foundation isn't bad, you're still the weakest among the first-generation holy knights. Duque immediately hit Gavin Rad's sore spot. In terms of martial arts, Gavin Rad wasn't much worse than the other three. The only person whom Gavin Rad was convinced of was Sai Dathrahan. But the power of the holy light came from the heart. The more pious one was, the more passionate one was about the holy light, and the stronger the holy light. After being blessed by the holy light, Uther became the one who could fight the most. He was tied with Turalian for second to last. Well, the weakest was Reginald Windsor. Okay, what power is that? The power of the storm. More accurately, the power of thunder. Huh. At this moment, Gavin Rad was tempted. This had nothing to do with the characteristics of the holy knight profession. On one hand, it was a matter of potential. This was the path of the holy light. He had reached the end of it. He wasn't as good as the best, but he could not become the best. On the other hand, as a knight from Stormwind City, Gavin Rad Bad Luck had good virtues and a martial family heritage. And the fundamental difference between him and Uther and the other first-generation holy knights was hatred. The hatred of being slaughtered by the orcs. Every family in the country had victims, and every Stormwind citizen had a deep hatred for the orcs. His little grudge was nothing much. But the path of the holy light did not allow for personal hatred. Gavin Rad could only suppress the anger in his heart and try to numb himself, telling himself that it was a selfless battle. In reality, he had failed. So his holy light power was near the bottom among the first-generation holy knights. If I'm not wrong, you can become a storm knight. Are there any risks? Calm down. When you're in danger, won't you activate invincibility? Oh, activate, holy shield technique. With that thought, Gavin Rad decided to do it. With the same trepidation as the ogre, Gavin Rad stood at the center of the altar. At this time, everyone was shocked to find that the altar was still in a state of being unable to be activated. According to the simplest estimation, it would take 5 pharaohs to activate. At this moment, Duque put on a magnificent performance. True mirror image, Duque's figure suddenly became blurry, and a blue Duque walked out from Duque's body. It was obvious that the one who walked out was a doppelganger. However, in less than a tenth of a second, the doppelganger that walked out of the doppelganger's body was quickly dyed with real colors, like a child playing a coloring game. In the blink of an eye, it was impossible to tell the difference between the doppelganger and the original Duque. 2 Duques came out, then 3 Duques. In the end, a total of 5 Duques walked out of the original body. Unlike the Orc Sword Saint's rigid, mirror image, which had the exact same movements as the original body, Duque's doppelganger seemed to be completely independent of the original body. They took different steps, and Duque, who was walking to the furthest position, jogged over. The 2 further away were walking at a brisk pace, while Duke's avatar, who was closest to them, was practically crawling. Different expressions, different movements. Such a vivid performance left the Windrunner sisters speechless. Second sister, are my eyes playing tricks on me? Why does it look like there are many brothers-in-law? Sasha shook her second sister's shoulder in astonishment, not even realizing that she had used the wrong address. It was also Sylvana's first time seeing this divine skill of Duque's. She tried her best to observe and spread out her senses, and only after a while did she realize the difference between the doppelganger and the original body. The doppelganger did not breathe, and there was no smell. However, the doppelganger had a real body. She felt the air that the doppelganger created when it moved forward, forming a weak wind. Aurelia was dazzled, and very naturally, she remembered the first time she met Duque. It was a chance encounter, and she thought that she had met a ghost, but she found a magical mage seedling. And when Duque was killed for the second time, she happened to witness it. To be honest, she still had not figured out what happened back then. But now, she felt that most of her doubts were explained. Duque was definitely a super magic genius. Of course, no one knew that Duque had killed the chief of the Fire Blade clan, Sword Saint Dar Triple Bloodblade, to get mirror image of truth. After everything was ready, the 5 doppelgangers of Duque began to cast spells at the same time under the control of the system elf. The principle was not much different from controlling Hand of Magic. In the eyes of others, it was cool. 5 doppelgangers that could chant different spells at the same time. With this talent, this magical method, the Windrunner sisters began to understand why Duque could rise so quickly in such a short time. It was almost the same as when Dan activated the altar. But because the pollution of the altar had been dispelled by Archbishop Fail, the tornado in the sky was golden and white. The mighty power of the lightning in the sky was broken down into countless threads and entered Gavin Rad's body, modifying the body of the first holy knight who was killed by Arthes in history. Lightning flashed and thunder roared. Such a large-scale phenomenon could not be hidden from anyone. 40 kilometers away, Dan, who was breaking the second runestone defense line in the Long Song forest, was suddenly alarmed. Someone actually restored the storm altar. That's impossible. You guys, go and take a look. Unfortunately, Dan, Google, and the few remaining warlocks of the Shadow Council were busy. They planned to use a new batch of runestones to build a new altar and could not leave at all. Having no choice, Dan could only order Talon Gorfiend, the first Death Knight in the world who had been strengthened by the Storm Altar, to go and take a look. Distance was an important factor. Warlocks did have the ability to teleport teammates across space through the means of summoning, but the premise was that there was a warlock on their side and 2 allies at the destination. Now, there was not a single tribe within 10 kilometers of Duque. At this time, the modification of Gavin Rad was completed. Chapter 372. Gavin Rad now had a hammer. It was his original physical hammer, as well as the Tempest Hammer, which was formed by the power of lightning in his left hand. Walking out of the altar, every step Gavin Rad exuded a terrifying power that was no weaker than Thunderstrike. With his feet as the center, large amounts of lightning spread out from the cracked ground. Tiny pieces of earth floated into the sky, ignoring gravity, but were turned into dust by the lightning that Gavin Rad released in midair. Gavin Rad was full of style now. This aura was no weaker than that of the Burning Legion's boss. Even if someone told Duque that Gavin Rad Misfortune was the real boss behind the scenes. If Duke didn't know what was going on, he would definitely believe 80% of it. Unfortunately, Gavin Rad's own words revealed the secret. Perhaps the iron rule of not being cool for 3 seconds worked. Gavin Rad actually asked, Boss Duque, will I electrocute my wife when I marry her in the future? The Windrunner sisters almost fell off the tree. Annoyed, Duque rolled his eyes. Idiot, can't you learn how to control your power? If that really happens, you can just marry a female holy knight. She won't die from electrocution. Duque didn't finish his sentence. If you're so stupid that you can't control your power, then when you do the life inheritance ritual with your wife, you can bathe her in holy light. Young man, it's a good thing to be full screen censored in battle. Duke didn't bother with Gavin Rad anymore and sent him to watch over the place. Time is limited. Which Windrunner wants to be the next to obtain power? Dan has already destroyed the runestone's energy field. In another half a day, the energy will dissipate without use. Also, this is the power passed down by the High Elves for thousands of years. The 4 Windstalker sisters looked at each other, none of them able to move their feet. Duke's next sentence caused the 2 sisters to be unable to remain calm. This is the Storm Altar. An altar that can awaken the power of those with suitable attributes. There are only 3 types of awakenings: thunder, fire, and wind. The power of the wind. This was a temptation that no Windrunner could resist. Once upon a time, the Windrunner were proud of their unparalleled archery skills. In their hearts, there was nothing that they could not kill with a single arrow. Unfortunately, more and more powerful monsters overturned their thoughts. A death knight who wouldn't necessarily die even if his head was pierced through. An ogre with 2 heads and 3 hearts. According to Duque, in the Draenor world where the orcs were originally from, there was a powerful creature that ruled over the ogres. Their name was Gollin. These terrifying creatures usually had a height of more than 10 meters, a huge body, and unparalleled brute force. In the coming days, they were likely to become the orcs' tools of war. They couldn't imagine the terrifying behemoth rampaging through the elven battle formation. Improving himself was already an urgent need. In addition, it was the power of the wind. The Windrunner's prime power. There was no way to refuse. As the eldest sister, Aurelia was the first to stand up. Duque, is this power safe? Duque sighed. This is the power left behind by your high elf ancestors. It has even been purified by the holy light. Alright, I'll go first. When I'm sure it's safe, I'll let you guys come too. Aurelia's beautiful figure stood in the center of the altar. Duque quickly began to cast the spell. After a short spell, there was no terrifying lightning and thunder like when Gavin Rad was awakened. Instead, a gentle whirlwind appeared around Aurelia. It was gentle and soft, like a mother caressing her child and murmuring a nursery rhyme in her ear. The feeling of the breeze caressing their faces was very comfortable. It was so comfortable that everyone present felt like falling asleep. Everyone heard the sound of the wind. Huff, huff, huff. It was the pulse of the earth and the breath of the sky. Gently opening her arms, Aurelia let her whole body bathe in the wind. In the wind, there was the scent of grass, the fragrance of the earth, and the unique fragrance of the forest. Listening to the sound of the wind and receiving its teachings, Aurelia was in a trance, as if she was intoxicated. The rapid energy reaction on the altar gradually subsided. The 3 Windrunner sisters watched their eldest sister, who was sitting down in the middle of the altar, and their hearts tightened. The most rebellious and easily agitated Servanas stared at Duque. Duque made an okay gesture, but then realized that they didn't understand, so he gave a thumbs up. Even though they were relieved, the 3 Windrunner sisters still stared at their eldest sister nervously. Suddenly, Aurelia, who had her eyes closed, stood up. She took out her longbow and pulled the bowstring, but she didn't nock an arrow. Shooting without a bowstring was the foundation of archery. What was their eldest sister doing? Aurelia's next action told everyone the answer. She shot an arrow. When she pulled the bowstring into the shape of a full moon, a gust of wind blew around the altar. The storm was gathering, obeying Aurelia Windrunner's request, voluntarily forming a wind arrow in less than half a second. This wasn't an illusion. The 3 Windrunner sisters saw the scene where the arrow should have been knocked change. Under normal circumstances, such a scene would only occur when the high temperature caused the water vapor on the ground to evaporate, distorting the light. Now, it appeared in Aurelia's hands. As the 2 tender fingers loosened, the sound of the bowstring vibrating suddenly rang out. However, there was no sound of the arrow being shot. No one could see the arrow's trajectory clearly. Everyone just instinctively looked in the direction the bow was aimed at. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. When the time reached 3 seconds, there was a reaction 500 meters away. A huge flower of blood bloomed on the treetops. For humans, it was already beyond the limit of their eyesight. To them, it was just a small dot. For the elven rangers with amazing eyesight, it was a huge test. However, the 3 Windrunner sisters saw it. Unparalleled accuracy. A powerful shot. 500 meters away, an arrow pierced through the troll's chest. Starting from the chest, the troll's entire body exploded into countless pieces. It was a troll scout. It wasn't easy to find this guy, who was good at hiding and had the same color as the forest, from 500 meters away. Not to mention this kind of attack that was almost beyond visual range. Aurelia finally opened her eyes, a warm smile on her dignified face. My sisters, I strongly recommend you to explore the limits of your power. Chapter 373. Storms were gathering, and thunder was roaring. Power was surging, and destiny was being rewritten. Duque raised his head, and looked at the vast and boundless sea of trees. His deep, black eyes looked past the lush forest, the marching orcs, and finally landed on the tribal flags that were fluttering in the wind like rags. No one knew what Duque was thinking. That sharp divine light that could pierce through all the fog and see the truth was what confused and intoxicated Aurelia the most. Duque's gaze seemed to contain the mysteries of the entire universe. After letting out a soft sigh, the divine light in Duque's eyes became more and more blurred. It was as if he had turned into a bronze dragon that controlled time, making time flow according to his will. It was as if he could see the torrent of history rolling forward according to its original direction, crushing all the hard work he had done. It shackled him with the shackles of time and space, allowing history to return to the path he was familiar with. The mysterious and unfathomable river of destiny seemed to have secretly merged with every river and sea in Azeroth, coiling around every mountain, plain, and continent. The future was like a layer of fog that could never be dispelled, shrouding the entire Alliance, and even the entire Azeroth. Duque didn't know how much his hard work could change the future. He could imagine that the current 79% accuracy rate would make the originally fixed future even more fragmented and unpredictable because of his hard work. To make up for those who have passed away, and the regrets that I thought were irreversible, everything is worth it, Duque muttered softly. In the past hour, the people around Duque all received unexpected benefits. Lightning. Sylvanas shouted, and surging waves of lightning gathered in her palm, turning into lightning arrows that contained great power. The lightning that circled around her made her look like a goddess of lightning that stood above the 9 heavens. Wind soaring. Vanessa had also awakened the power of the wind. Although she couldn't compare to her sister Aurelia in terms of quality and quantity, she was exceptionally light. It wasn't hard to imagine that Vanessa would have an absolute advantage in terms of speed. Eagle Eye. Lilith was a little puzzled. She had awakened this scouting ability. It didn't feel like it had much to do with the wind, and there was almost no increase in combat power. Wind release. Vanessa waved her 2 daggers agilely in the air. The graceful twirls in the air made people wonder if she had already overcome gravity. Ice mist. After dispelling the influence of the wind, Elucia easily condensed a cold mist in the air and enveloped herself. When the people around her finished upgrading, they all turned to look at Duque. Dooku, even though the horde is almost here, we can help you hold them off for at least 10 minutes. If there's anything else you can get, just do it. Illyria's encouragement came from the wind. The other 3 Windrunner sisters nodded in unison. Duke smiled. He first opened a portal and sent Elucia and Vanessa, the 2 weaker ones, back. He then stood on the storm altar. After standing on it, Duque couldn't help but laugh. Once upon a time, he had been worried about the gains and losses of even the most basic, level 1 fireball spell. Now that he was faced with an unknown power, Duque was surprised to find that he didn't seem to have much hope or fear for the final outcome. Perhaps it was because he had changed from a simple transmigrator to a university. After experiencing numerous challenges and hardships, he had completely matured. He had worried countless times that if history had changed drastically, he would lose his judgment of the future. But after ascending to a high position and commanding the Alliance's army to victory time and time again, his heart was becoming more determined. He began to have confidence and was no longer afraid of failure or setbacks. Thinking about the forces that would invade Azeroth in the future and the terrifying monsters that could easily be as tall as a 10-story building, he was originally a little afraid. But now, the results of his hard work were turning into a source of confidence. The power of magic. The power of power. The support of friends and subordinates. All of these turned into an indescribable confidence that supported him to continue moving forward. As long as he grasped this power, he would have endless power to overcome all obstacles, break through the fate of destruction, dispel the fog in front of him, and embark on the path of the bright future. That was the fate of Azeroth and Duque's fate. With that thought, Duque no longer hesitated. The 5 avatars chanted a simple incantation, driving the temporarily made storm altar to make its final effort. The force of nature deep in the ground that was about to dissipate was surging for the last time under the guidance of Duque's will. The feedback from various parts of the altar allowed the force of earth to connect with his body, giving him a feeling that the force of earth was connected to his fate and magic circuit. The next moment, a strong gust of wind blew in the sky again. Countless drifting forces in the air gathered in the direction of the storm altar in an even more exaggerated and majestic manner than the people who had awakened before. It was a giant tornado that hovered 100 meters in the air and had a diameter of more than 5 kilometers. For a moment, Aurelia and the others all turned to look at it. Countless long purple-blue lightning bolts were twisting in the air above the storm altar like spiritual snakes. The high-energy lightning chains disintegrated and filtered all impurities, making the wind blowing on the altar extremely cool and clean. The cool breeze wrapped around Duque's limbs and blew away all the dirt on Duque's body. The lightning came to Duque's head and turned into countless tiny harmless electric currents that entered Duque's shoulders and flowed throughout Duque's body. The strange feeling of the lightning entering his body was not the numbing feeling of destruction that he had imagined. Instead, it was a little strange. In the slightly numb feeling, Duque felt that his body was becoming more and more resilient under the stimulation of the electric currents. And the special understanding of wind, lightning, and fire began to spread to the depths of his soul. This was not an empty experience that came through incantations or spells. This was the most direct and unobstructed contact with the force of nature. It was precisely because of this rare experience that he had rooted in the deepest part of his heart that the power of his magic would definitely reach a higher level. In Duque's vision, the emerald green system notification was jumping wildly along with the surging storm power in the air. Congratulations, host, you have mastered the power of wind and lightning. You have comprehended and mastered the special improved spell, Thunder Spear. You have mastered the Thunderstorm Wall. You have mastered the Electric Shield. Chapter 374. There was nothing much to say about the scene of Duque leading everyone to retreat. Duque didn't plan on fighting Ghoul Dan while he was surrounded by the beast men. After the Windrunner wreaked havoc on the beast men, Duque opened a portal and retreated. If they didn't leave now, once Ghoul Dan arrived, no one would be able to leave. The only thing Duque could use now was Ghoul Dan's contempt for him, or rather, Ghoul Dan's scheme to screw Orgrim over. Early the next morning, Aurelia appeared outside the Silvermoon Council's meeting hall. Apologies, General Windrunner. The Silvermoon Council is currently in its daily meeting. You can't enter. You barged into the council last time, and many council members are furious at your reckless and vulgar actions. The guard captain blocked Aurelia. The huge kite shield in his hand was dazzling in Aurelia's eyes. Aurelia did her best to suppress her emotions. Eversong Forest has been invaded. From yesterday afternoon until this morning, we lost a total of 7 teams. The highest level of requests for help have filled the entire communication room, and now you're telling me not to disturb that damn daily meeting? We're in a state of war. But, without another word, Aurelia took out the thing that Duque had asked her to bring last night. The head of a troll. It spun in the air, its long black hair that was braided into dozens of strange braids dancing in the air. The sunlight shone on its long fangs, and it crashed into the kite shield that blocked all information from the outside world. Finally, it landed at the feet of the guard captain. The air froze for a moment. Every single one of the 12 guards stared at the head. In the next moment, Aurelia opened a bag and revealed the thing inside. It was a beautiful magic crystal nameplate that marked the identity of a high elf soldier. If the nameplate was taken off, it would only mean one thing: death in battle. There were many nameplates, but the most shocking thing was that among the blood-stained nameplates, the guard captain found many nameplates of platoon leaders and even senior captains. The faces of all the guards suddenly changed. Aurelia once again broke into the Silver Moon Council that she was familiar with and hated. When the chairman of the parliament saw Aurelia's heroic and dignified face, he was immediately enraged. For the sake of Silvery Moon City, can you stop interrupting the sacred meeting? I'm really sorry. No matter how good-tempered Aurelia was, when she saw these high and mighty counselors who did not care about worldly affairs, the anger in her heart rose to her throat. Longsong Forest has been invaded. Are you only willing to stop the sacred meeting and face the coming of the war when the tribe reaches this sacred gate? Everyone could hear the bitter irony in Aurelia's words. Impossible. A great lord suddenly stood up and pointed a finger at Aurelia, his tone abnormally harsh. No one can survive after passing through those runestones. Huh? No. Aurelia raised her long golden eyebrows. Are you sure? Are you talking about this kind of runestone? Aurelia took out a piece of runestone the size of 2 palms from her bag, raised her hand, and threw it at the great lord. The lifespan of the High Elves was quite long, and many of the counselors present were mages who had set up the runestones. It was precisely because of the great achievement of firmly protecting Kuel's Salis that they could transcend ordinary people and become noble beings who dared to challenge the king and were superior to all beings. Now, their pride, their reliance, had vanished into thin air in the blink of an eye. Every counselor's heart beat violently, and they almost forgot to breathe. Great Lord Moria, your territory seems to be in the southern part of the Longsong Forest, right? Do you want to find a high balcony and see if there are flames rising in your territory? Illyria's words made High Lord Moria jump up as if his buttocks had been slapped by a whip. Ignoring the clown, Aurelia looked straight at the Sun King. I don't want to repeat the warning I've given you. I just want to tell you a fact. There is no doubt that the trolls have entered our forest, trampled our land, and slaughtered our people. The orcs that I've mentioned are now following them. They don't have the agility and stealth of the trolls, but they have strong bodies and their numbers are like locusts. They are planning to destroy our home together with the trolls. Aurelia panted heavily, and her chest rose and fell rapidly. The whole hall was very, very quiet, and only her heavy breathing could be heard. Aurelia raised her head, and there was endless pain and heartache on her face. Finally, I just want to ask, are you all damned deaf and blind? Do you want all the rangers at the border to die in battle? Do you want all the elves in the Longsong Forest to be slaughtered? Do you want to wait until you face the ferocious faces of the trolls and smell their nauseating breath? Only then are you willing to admit that a full-scale war has come to us, the High Elves. Aurelia's voice was very melodious. As she pleaded, she opened the blood-stained bag again, and countless nameplates fell out and fell on the shiny white tiles, making clanking sounds. Whether it was the king, the speaker, or the counselors, the pupils of all the elves suddenly shrank, and they stared at the nameplates for a long time, speechless. They looked at the fresh troll head presented by the guard captain. The Sun King, an Astrian Sunstrider, burst out with a loud roar. Damn, this time, the Sun King's outburst was not because of Aurelia. The Elven King slapped the troll's head hard, and it flew into the air. The head did not have a chance to fall to the ground, because in mid-air, it had been instantly incinerated by the Sun King's destructive flames. The high-temperature embers scattered on the floor of the Silvermoon Council's meeting hall. The Sun King furrowed his brows, and his eyes that were muddy most of the time became as sharp as a sword. The trolls dare to invade our home. Anastrian was completely enraged. They dare to do this. He looked up, and his expression was like that of a furious brown bear. We will let them use their lives and blood to wash away their sins. Gather our warriors, gather our rangers, we will launch an all-out attack on the trolls, drive them out of our forest, and use their heads to build our new border. Chapter 375. Although Aurelia was happy to see her king finally become determined, she had to remind the Sun King, the trolls are not everything. The threat of the horde is the most important. Fortunately, I brought powerful reinforcements. Duke Marcus of Stormwind City and his 30,000 private soldiers. Unexpectedly, the Sun King refused. No, I don't need human help. The High Elves can deal with the invaders themselves. Summon my son, Kale, that's. Aurelia instinctively felt that something was wrong. The elves were too arrogant and isolated. They thought that they were the source of the world's civilization. They thought that humans were just picking up the magic left behind by the elves. They thought that the mechanical creations of the dwarves and gnomes were evil. Thousands of years of isolation had not brought the elves anything other than the arrogance of the high elves. No, perhaps there was. It was depravity. Thinking back to 3,000 years ago, Anastrian had almost been forced to abdicate by the Silver Moon Council. The reason was that Anastrian had taught the humans too much magic. Aurelia shouted for her king to pay attention to the orcs. Unfortunately, her opinion was once again ignored. Her clear voice was drowned out by the noisy argument between the Lord and the mage counselors. In the end, the Sun King dismissed Aurelia with a few words. Thank you for informing me again, my Ranger General. Now is the time for you to fulfill your duty. Bring your ranger troops and stop all the trolls. Before our army arrives, I do not wish to hear more news of the fall of the trolls. Wait. Where are the reinforcements? Our losses are already very severe. More than half of the troops have been crippled, and we have less than half of our full strength. Aurelia tried to argue. There are no reinforcements. Even if you can't do it, you must do it. The country let you lead the ranger troops to pacify the border. Yes, evacuating the people is also your duty. If you can't stop them, then bury yourself there too. What a joke. The ranger troops that were left with less than 3,000 people to fight against the allied army of 100,000 orcs and trolls. One had to know that the elven rangers had no advantage against the trolls. The current situation was that they couldn't even stop the trolls, and they still had to evacuate the civilians. Aurelia was furious. Of course, at this time, Aurelia naturally thought of Duque. Unexpectedly, the Sun King added, I don't care if your boyfriend is nearby. You are now the general of Cuel Salis. Do your duty, or I will prosecute you for treason. Also, if humans enter our borders without our permission, then we'll deal with them the same way we dealt with the trolls. The Sun King's words made Aurelia's heart sink into an icy hell. What time was it? Did they really think that they could rely on the elves to win this interracial war? It was obvious that they couldn't win if they didn't work together. Your Majesty. Aurelia raised her voice. Guards, take her away. Let the council send an army supervisor to ensure that the two generals of the Windrunner family fulfill their duties. The Sun King waved his hand, and nearly 10 kite shields of the Imperial Guards quickly blocked the line of sight between her and the Sun King. Sorry, it's my duty. Please. The guard captain didn't look good either. Everyone's eyes were bright. Aurelia, the hero of the Trolls' War, had been stationed at the border for more than 3,000 years for the safety of Cuel Salis. This time, she had informed them of the large-scale invasion of the trolls in advance. The first time, she was completely humiliated by the counselors with words. The second time, even though she had the great merit of alerting the higher-ups, she was given the cold shoulder again because of her background. In the end, it was because all the higher-ups of the elves were mages, and they had a fanatical admiration for spellcasters. All beings other than the spellcasters were regarded as cannon fodder. If the Windrunner family was a mage family, she would have become the hero of Cuel Salis again by now. Aurelia was taken away. When a substitute counselor appeared among the heavily damaged rangers as an army supervisor, everyone's lungs were about to explode. Bastard! The Silver Moon Council is like Chocobo *T. Sister. Since we agreed to become Duque's vassals, we might as well let Duque's troops come in early, and we'll just pretend we didn't see it. Servanas, the most rebellious of the Windrunner sisters, cursed angrily. But all she got was a slap in the face. Servanas was stunned by the slap. Aurelia's sharp voice said, "You and I are now Qul Salus's ranger generals. Right now, our hometown is under attack. How can you face the country and the people by saying this? As long as we still carry the epaulets of Qul Salus, His Majesty's orders are absolute." Not to mention Servanas, even Aurelia felt an unsuppressible sense of grievance. Servanas argued unwillingly, "There are clearly better ways to solve this crisis and avert a possible disaster, but you gave up everything because of your arrogance. This kind of method will kill countless people. Do you really want to suppress your unhappiness and force yourself to accept it? What else can I do? This is a time of war. If after the war, everyone is safe, of course I can peacefully serve Duque. But right now, our hometown is burning. If I do anything special, it will be treason." Aurelia couldn't help but shout. Sasha and Lilith watched the two sisters argue and couldn't get a word in. Both sides felt that they were right, but they couldn't come up with any better ideas. Sasha could only look like she was about to cry and persuade the two sisters to stop arguing. Servanas stubbornly said, "Idiot. Don't you rely on Duque a lot? Then go find him. That guy has a lot of ideas. I'm sure he will think of something better than you." "Yes. Why don't you go find Duque?" With her sister's cover, Aurelia found the human mage that Duque had placed in the ranger army, Darnielle, and asked him to send a message to Duque using magic. Very soon, Aurelia contacted Duque. After she told him about her difficulties, Duque laughed. "Idiot, you should have come to me earlier. I was thinking, if you were captured by the Sun King, should I declare war on Qul Salus? Or should I use political means to bail you out? Please, I'm asking for your help. Duque, don't make trouble." Aurelia sounded like she was about to cry. "You must be joking. This joke isn't funny at all. Alright, leave the task of delaying the orcs to me. You focus on organizing the evacuation of the people. What do you plan to do? Your soldiers can't cross the border. I promise that not a single soldier from the Alliance or Stormwind will cross the border." Chapter 376. Once again, it was proven that Aurelia had once again underestimated Duque's intelligence. Or rather, she had underestimated Duque's ability to play with words. On this day, more than 5,000 goblin spirit robots strode across the Qul Salus border, which was no longer under the control of the elves. The Windrunner sisters were dumbfounded. They were completely dumbfounded. This is possible. Aurelia looked at Duque on the other side of the border. Why not? Duque put his hands on his hips. Is it wrong for a toy to accidentally cross the border? Furthermore, which eye of yours saw that these are mine? These are clearly elven products. Aurelia rolled her eyes at Duque flirtatiously. Her expression was truly complicated. She was gratified, but also did not know whether to laugh or cry. Right. In theory, these goblins belonged to the elves. Why? Did he not see the words Qul Salus 10,086th Border Guard written in the human language on the outer shell of the goblin's armor? Of course, the elves would not have such a terrible designation, nor would they use a language other than the High Elves' language. They would also not have these gnome-style robots that would affect the appearance of the elves. Silvermoon City also had battle puppets, but those magic puppets were all round and curvaceous. They were obviously arcane style. In any case, not a single human soldier had crossed the border. In order to avoid suspicion, Duque had even transferred Darnielle back. A perfect game of words. Duque naturally would not do such a thing for the Bulsh *T Sun King. He only did it for the Windrunner sisters. More accurately, it was for Aurelia. Aurelia was very clear what Duque had paid for this. Duque had set up a fully automated robot production line in Karazhan. Naturally, Khadgar would help Duque with the work. To transport so many goods over, Duque had to do it himself. Duque was still not strong enough. He could only transport no more than 1 ton of people or goods at a time. Even so, Duque was exhausted. He was like a dead dog for the whole day. However, it was enough to receive a grateful look from Aurelia. He had to fight in the horde, and he had to pick up girls along the way. Nothing could be more perfect than that. On this day, the giant demon army, which had originally had an overwhelming advantage, ran into a huge problem. Because of Yao Yao Ling. Most of the giant demons that had been tricked by Yao Yao had died. The tribe was indeed annoyed by the warning function of the demon spirits. No one had expected that the combined power of the Yao Yao spirit and the Elven Ranger would be so amazing. Those seemingly silly mechanical creations wandered aimlessly in the Long Song forest. However, a high-speed paint arrow would suddenly shoot out from the Yao Yao spirit and hit a giant demon that was hiding on the tree. In a jungle battle, under the premise that both sides wanted to kill the other, the most important thing was to discover the other side first. In previous battles, concealment and enemy detection techniques were the most important. Observation, judgment, and experience were all indispensable. Any miscalculation would result in death. The appearance of the Yao Yao spirit completely broke this balance. First of all, the Yao Yao spirit was not afraid of death. It was a mechanical creation, and if it was destroyed, it could be dragged away. It was impossible to repair it on the spot. Duque ran back to Karazhan overnight to practice engineering, and all he could do was fiddle with a mobile version of the waste recycling robot 74A. This thing would automatically find the dead Yao Yao spirit robots in the forest, recycle their wreckage, and decompose them into the necessary engineering parts. Without any worries, the Yao Yao spirit naturally went to seek death. The Elven Ranger squad followed far behind, and the Yao Yao spirit boldly opened the way. For example, this time, the Yao Yao spirit suddenly shouted, "Help! There's a pervert!" After splashing paint on a certain troll on the tree, the troll himself was hit by a flying axe and died immediately. Its sacrifice was worth it. In the next second, the giant demon was shot in the head by the Elven Ranger who followed. The Rangers were embarrassed, but it was undeniable that the Yao Yao spirit's reconnaissance was very good. They concluded a pattern that they didn't know whether to laugh or cry. There's a pervert. There was a giant demon. There are a few perverts. There were no more than 5 giant demons. So many perverts. That was about 10. No, there are too many perverts. I have to give up on healing. This meant that there were more than 50 giant demons, and the Rangers had to retreat immediately. It had to be said that with the help of the Yao Yao spirit, Aurelia only relied on less than 3,000 Rangers to hold off 50,000 giant demons. She also freed up more than 300 Rangers with minor injuries to organize the evacuation in the rear. Everyone, don't panic. Hold on, Silvermoon's reinforcements will arrive soon. In order to calm the people, Aurelia had to say some nonsense that she didn't even believe herself. How could Silvermoon's reinforcements arrive so quickly? Unless Anastrian was willing to send out Silvermoon's regular army, it would take at least 3 days to gather the troops. But would the Horde give her 3 days? It was also that night that the Horde's main force arrived. Unlike the giant demons who charged straight into Longsong Forest, the orcs also sent out a detachment to attack the Windrunner's hometown, Windwalk Village, and the Windrunner Tower at the southwestern edge of Longsong Forest. Thanks to Aurelia's advance notice, even though the officials sent by Silvermoon forbade the Windrunner family from evacuating to Silvermoon in advance, every family had already made preparations to retreat. Packing things in advance was not against the law, was it? Almost as soon as Silvermoon's permission to retreat was given, all the elves in the village threw their belongings into the elven transport ships that had been prepared beforehand in an orderly manner. In just 2 hours, they had all evacuated. The detachment of the orcs could only run back and follow behind the main force to guard against Duque's possible attack. However, the efforts of the Rangers only managed to slow down the Horde. The Horde's green tide drowned out all resistance. In just 3 days, the Horde had killed their way to the Eastern Temple, which was only 100 kilometers south of Silvermoon City. The elves relied solely on the temple's powerful magical defense system to resist the horde's attack. As the horde invested a large number of two-headed ogre mages, the situation began to worsen. At this moment, Prince Kale, who had rushed back, saw the army of 25,000 people that had been hastily assembled. Looking at the troops that his father and the Silvermoon Council had gathered for him, Kale's face was ashen. What kind of joke is this? This is the army that you want me to fight against a 100,000 horde army? Most of the 25,000 people were local garrison troops that had withdrawn from the front lines. Unlike the rangers who had always been fighting at the front lines, the training of these garrison troops was terrible, and most of them had been killed by the orcs. Most importantly, Kale realized that there was a serious lack of warriors in this army. Warriors who could hold the front and suppress the enemy's formation. Chapter 377. I'm sorry, my child. This is the strongest army I can gather for you. Kale looked excited. For the sake of the Well of the Sun. Didn't I keep sending letters to my father a year ago to tell him about the threat of the tribe? All the motions to prepare for war were rejected by the council. The reason was that Kuel's Salis was not at risk of being affected by the flames of war, so there was no reason to increase the defense budget. In fact, until 3 days ago, the councillors still believed that the runestone array was invincible. Now, the entire Kuel's Salis is in chaos, and the country seriously lacks pre-war mobilization. We are very passive. The Sun King sighed deeply, his face filled with worry and resentment. Council. Silvermoon Council again. The cancer that imprisoned the entire High Elves and rejected all progress and change. The resentment in his heart almost caused Kale's chest to explode. No matter how well educated he was, he had the urge to scream and vent his anger. Why did a prince like him have to study in the Dalajan for a long time? To put it nicely, it was to let the prince go out to absorb new knowledge. To put it bluntly, the Silvermoon Council, whose power was above the royal power, exiled him in order to limit the royal power. Who could understand the frustration of not being able to return to his home? His excellent self-restraint allowed Kale to suppress the anger in his heart. Of course, over the years in the Dalajan, Kale had also gained a lot of knowledge. Perhaps the High Elves had unparalleled talent in using magic, but the development of magic was no longer the same magic world in the minds of the elves that had not changed for thousands of years. It was bad enough that the high-level elves refused to accept new things, but they were so arrogant and stupid that they did not even care about the enemy in front of them. They only cried out when the enemy put a knife to their neck. Ah! So there really is an enemy? Although he was angry, Kale was still very clear-headed. Having deeply experienced the ferocity of the tribe, he knew very well that it was impossible for this rotten army to defeat the tribe. But for the sake of his people, Kale resolutely accepted this appointment. There was no other reason, just because his surname was Sunstrider. He was the only heir of the Kuel's Salis royal family. Since birth, he had been trained as a perfectionist, and glory and responsibility had long been branded in the deepest part of his noble soul. He was duty-bound to save his hometown. Kale lowered his head and said, "Father, for the sake of the Well of the Sun and the continuation of the High Elves, I'm willing to sacrifice my life for Kuel's Salis." Sacrifice his life? These words were very serious, so serious that even the Sun King was shocked. He immediately felt that something was wrong. He knew very well that his son wouldn't say such harsh words without any special reason. The Sun King wanted his only successor to die on the battlefield? Stop joking. It wasn't easy to find an opportunity to make things difficult for the council. Anastrian summoned Kale, back so that Kale, could have a glorious return like a king. So that Kale could better inherit his throne in the future and one day limit the excessive power of the Silvermoon Council. Child, is this tribe really that powerful? Anastrian's energy was no longer what it used to be. Too much of it had been consumed by internal strife, turning the Sun King who ended the war against the trolls into a fatuous ruler, who was an expert in internal strife and a layman in external warfare. The upper echelons of Kuel Salis wouldn't take ordinary warriors seriously. No matter how many orc warriors there were, they would only treat them as ants. After deliberating in his heart for a while, Kale, that said, let's not talk about anything else. There's a warlock named Ghoul Dan among the orcs in the tribe. He fought to a draw with the Dalajan Antonidas in a head-on battle. Hiss. The Sun King was finally moved. Whether it was him or the Silvermoon Council, most of them looked down on human mages. But there was an exception, Antonidas, the strongest super-genius mage in the Dalajan in the past 100 years. In a semi-public competition 30 years ago, Anastrian and Antonidas had fought to a draw. This battle had also established Antonidas' transcendental status in the Dalajan. The Sun King could look down on any spellcaster, but he couldn't look down on Antonidas. Powerhouses didn't discriminate between races or countries. An orc powerhouse who was as famous as Antonidas couldn't be overestimated. The Sun King rubbed his chin. Child, how about this? I'll give you a team of arcane puppets from the garrison of Silvermoon City, along with 10 mountain giants and 2 spellbreakers. Go fight a beautiful victory and come back. Kale, that's face finally lit up. At that moment, the father and son didn't realize that they'd been tricked. First, it was Ghoul Dan. In the entire alliance and even the world of Azeroth, no one except Duque knew where Ghoul Dan's true strength was. In terms of high-end combat power, the elves had made the first mistake. Second, it was their understanding of the orc warrior's strength. Other than the Windrunner sisters, none of the high-ranking elves had personally been to the battlefield. Their understanding of the orcs was also only on paper. They only saw the exchange ratio after the battle between the humans and the orcs. They felt that the humans and orcs suffered similar losses, so they equated the combat power of the orc warriors with the human warriors. No one cared. This was the exchange ratio that Duque had used to its limit. Finally, it was the change brought about by the runestones. In the elves' impression, the runestone's defensive circle was broken, so be it. No one could understand how much the storm altar, which was made of rune stones, could improve the tribe. Now that all the ogres in the tribe had become two-headed, the physical qualities of the ogres were considered high on this planet. After the biggest problem of mental retardation had been eliminated, their combat power had more than doubled. Moreover, there were a large number of ogre mages among the thousands of ogres. How could a single-core CPU compare to a dual-core one? Just like that, the great Prince Kale, that's valiantly led the army against the invaders on his first journey in life. The army of 27,000 people stretched from the capital of Silvermoon City all the way to the city gate. In the majestic army, every soldier's armor was adorned with exquisite carvings and patterns. A bright red background, beautiful golden edges, and a winged headband that only had weak defensive capabilities apart from decoration. Since they were fighting at home, the chocobos that pulled the carriages did not bring too much baggage. Instead, they brought a large number of magic stones and various musical instruments to boost morale. A mage close to the Windrunner family sent a magic mirror. When Duque and the others saw this scene, they were completely dumbfounded. Even a righteous young man like Reginald Windsor could not help but complain, "What the hell, are they going to war or an armed patrol?" Chapter 378. War. In every war, there would be all sorts of strange things, be it inventions, tactics, or something else. A country with enough strategic depth could rely on its vast territory to fight and retreat, giving the rear enough time to react and grow, accumulating strength for a future counterattack. Small countries, once their capital was used up, it would be easy for the country to be destroyed in a few days. Kuel Salis was neither big nor small. In terms of land area, its actual territory was about Eversong Forest and half of the land of the Ghost in the future. At most, it was a third of the size of Lordaeron. In the land of the Ghost, the other half was the Trolls' territory, which was controlled by Zwaman's Amani troll clan. Their territory clearly did not have any strategic depth, but they still rejected the humans' help and played the tactic of adding fuel to the fire. Duque did not know what to say about this. Rubbing his brow, Duque whispered, "It's good to let Aurelia give up." With that, Duque conveyed his analysis to Aurelia. Aurelia immediately rushed to Kale, that sighed as if her butt was on fire. "Your Highness. Are you planning to let the army fight the horde on the plains?" Aurelia was someone who knew how to use troops. With so many burly arcane constructs and the even larger mountain giants, it was impossible for them to fight in the forest. "What's the problem, General Windrunner?" "General Windwalker." Kale, that's revealed a gentle and refined smile. "Your Highness. We can't fight the horde head-on. The High Elves lack enough vanguards. The arcane constructs are not bad, and the mountain giants are also very powerful. But they are too few in number. Once the vanguard is defeated, all the mages and rangers in the rear will be hunted down by the horde like ducks," Aurelia argued. After hanging out with Duque for so long, she had heard about the tragic battles in the Elven Forest during the Stormwind last year. Aurelia knew very well how terrifying an orc army could be on flat ground when they went all out. In fact, in places like South Shore and the South Flow Coast, the humans had also used high-intensity fortifications to weaken the beastmen's mobility and sharpness to the extreme. That was how they managed to achieve such a magnificent exchange rate. Now, Kale, that's actually wanted to fight the horde on the plains? Aurelia felt that not only Kale, but the entire upper echelon of the High Elves had gone crazy. "Please watch your tone, Sir Ranger General. In the face of a great battle, your pessimism is the worst." Following the direction of the voice, Aurelia noticed an unusually burly warrior beside the prince. Most of the elves were slender and weak in terms of strength and physique. There were always exceptions to everything. For example, this person in front of him. Just by looking at his figure in the middle of the night, he looked no different from a troll. Tall, strong, bulging muscles filled with surging power and beauty. "You are." He couldn't see any military epaulets, but he could tell from the mark on his breastplate that he was a baron. Baron Saguna, a follower of His Highness. Oh. He was a hardcore fan of Kale, Despite staying in the Dalajan for many years, Kale, had still won over a group of diehard followers who weren't of high status. Aurelia was annoyed with him. "I'm not being pessimistic. I'm just objectively speaking as an elf who has really fought against the horde. I'm telling His Highness the difference in strength between us and the enemy. Understand? May I ask how many beastmen you've killed?" Saguna raised his nose slightly, his eyes full of disdain. Aurelia narrowed her eyes. "The number of kills verified by the Lordaeron Alliance is 1,388 orc warriors. There were already so many verified ones. Those that weren't, this was an era where heroes were worshipped. Killing one person was considered a murderer. Killing 10 people was considered a butcher. But killing 100 people was considered a hero. Not to mention killing the evil beastmen and trolls who had invaded their homeland." Saguna was finally moved. Only now did he remember that this noble and wild female ranger standing in front of him was a very famous hero since the Troll War. At this moment, Kale, helped his people out. He pondered for a moment. "I understand your concerns, General. Let's do it this way. The plan for the decisive battle remains the same, but the location of the decisive battle will be the plains south of the Eastern Temple. I'll have to trouble the Windrunner's ranger to cover it." Kale, pointed to the Windrunner's defensive area, which happened to be the Eastern Temple. It had to be said that after being suppressed by the Council for so many years, the most important skill Kale, had learned was compromise. Perhaps this would put him further and further away from the realm of heroes, but it was undoubtedly in line with the national conditions of the upper echelons of Kuel Salis. A qualified and mellow politician would undoubtedly be better off than an upright and outspoken hero. The location of the decisive battle was under the cover of their own defensive line. Even if there was a so-called in case, the army could retreat under the cover of the relatively complete magic defense system of the Holy Temple. Aurelia trembled all over, but in the end, she didn't argue any further. Kale, that's had already given in, at least avoiding the worst outcome. No one could find fault with the decision to withdraw the Ranger team, which had suffered the most losses since the start of the war, to the second line. Listening to the surrounding lackeys of the prince flatter her with, "His Highness is wise," Aurelia felt as disgusted as if she had swallowed a fly. She saluted and left. The next day. Standing on a high hill and watching the forest and elven villages that were being set ablaze, Orgrim felt a rare sense of elation that he had not felt since the start of the battle. "The scouts have reported that the Longears are foolish enough to fight us on the plains?" he asked his aide. "Is that true?" Zulud, the chief of the Dragon Roar tribe, nodded. "That's right. They probably believe that before we defeat their vanguard, they can use their damned magic to destroy us." Orgrim sneered. "All right, the great orc warriors shouldn't waste their energy on the enemy's magic. Especially when there's a choice, let Ghoul, Dan's new toy, go first." The second battle of the Dark Portal, a completely different battle of Kuel Salis, officially began on the 2nd of June. Hoot 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 hoot. The distinctive horn of the High Elves sounded. The horns of the Horde were usually rough and bold, while the horns of the Alliance were majestic and heroic, while the horns of the Elven Alliance were, King, the horns of the Elven Alliance were completely used as trumpets. There were even buttons on the trumpets that could be played with cadence. The Elven army, which the royal Sunstrider family had high hopes for, walked out of a lush green forest. The entire enemy's formation was presented in front of these elves who hadn't fought for nearly 3,000 years. The elves sneered. The Horde's formation was too scattered, like a group of beggars gathered together. Chapter 379. There were all kinds of equipment on the tribe's side. War hammers made of stone, spears made of sharpened tree branches, armor made of animal hides that were pieced together from tree branches, and fresh catapults. At first glance, one would think that their opponent was an uncivilized savage tribe. The trolls on the flanks of the orcs were still the same as they were thousands of years ago. The spears were all made out of sharp stones. While they were quite dangerous to the almost unarmored rangers, they were completely useless against the heavily armored elven infantry and arcane constructs. The elven soldiers' initial nervousness disappeared when they saw the scene in front of them, followed by soft laughter. "I thought it was some amazing intelligent race that could break through our defense with runes. The rangers at the border are also useless. They actually lost all their dignity to these fellows, sending out dozens of letters for help in a day." The soldiers' laughter drifted into the ears of the rangers stationed at the eastern defense line of the temple. Every elf ranger was furious. The 4 Windrunner sisters stood in different postures. Aurelia stood proudly against the wind like a pine tree. She was expressionless, but anyone could see the pain in her eyes. Servanas crossed his arms and leaned against the shadow of a pillar in the temple. He had his back to the battlefield, and a bone-chilling smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Sasha, who was supposed to be the most lively, hugged her knees and sat on the stairs of the temple, not saying a word. Lilith, on the other hand, covered her forehead with her right palm and looked into the distance. "Big sister, it's the trash in front, and the elites of the Blackrock tribe at the back. There seems to be a special fog spell at the back." Duque was right again. Aurelia, the great hero of the Troll War, mumbled to herself in a daze. Soon, her green eyes regained their vigor. "As long as Duque is here, the High Elves will not perish." Then, she raised her voice and shouted, "Hadgeron! Lor Themar!" 2 elven rangers immediately walked behind Aurelia. Hadgeron Brightwing reporting. Lorthma Theron reporting. Aurelia turned around. "Is everything ready?" The 2 ranger captains were a little hesitant. After a short moment of shock, they replied in unison, "We're ready." "That's good." Aurelia nodded. She didn't realize that she had just given orders to two of the three most powerful men in Silvermoon City. On the other side, both sides sounded the horns of marching at almost the same time. All the elven warriors did the same action and put on their helmets. The elven helmets were very different from the Arathor standard helmets commonly used by the Alliance. Its decorative significance was far greater than its actual combat significance. Compared to the half-mask style of the Alliance's helmet, the elven helmet was more like a beautifully carved visor. There were complex patterns and extremely fine dyeing on it. From afar, it seemed as if the entire mountain and plains were reflecting gold and red light. Because of the widespread use of the kite shield, the soldiers' movements were also quite agile. However, when Orgrim saw this relatively narrow shield on the podium, the great chief let out a cold laugh. On the other side, on a huge podium held up by 4 5-meter-tall, huge arcane constructs, the great legitimate heir of the Sunstrider royal family, Kale, showed off his dazzling appearance in front of the army. Every wave of his hand and every movement had an unimaginable charm. Pointing lightly into the distance, Kale, shouted, "Cover fire." As the messenger's voice spread through the unimaginably mature magic communication system to the mages at the rear. On the hillside near the eastern temple, a continuous line of fire lit up the entire horizon, emitting a dazzling light. This was the fireball spell cast by more than 1,000 earth mages at the same time. It was already equivalent to the total number of mages in several human kingdoms, but for the high elves, this was just the standard. In fact, mages made up more than 1/10 of the elven army. The momentum created by so many mages was incomparably terrifying. Whoosh, 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 with continuous whistling sounds, countless fireballs passed over the heads of the elven infantrymen and reached the orc stragglers who were beginning to charge on the other side of the battlefield. It was an instinctive premonition of impending disaster. Every orc warrior who was about to be hit felt a tingling sensation on their scalps. None of the orcs panicked, and none of them retreated. They continued to roar as they charged. After 10 seconds, a sea of crimson flames descended from the sky, covering the orcs' already somewhat messy and loose charging formation. More than 800 orc warriors were directly turned into ashes, and twice that number of orcs became burning human-shaped torches, struggling and rolling in the flames. It could be imagined that in a moment, they would become charred corpses. Next, it was time to harvest. That was what the elven infantrymen thought as they advanced with the kite shield in one hand. No army could maintain their morale in a situation where they had suffered such a blow. That was what their instructors said when they were training. Unfortunately, they encountered an exception. Even though more than half of their compatriots had been swallowed by the flames, the orcs whose bodies were relatively intact still launched a frenzied charge. "This is impossible," a female mage beside Kale, cried out in shock. Kale, narrowed his eyes. He pretended to be calm, but the others could hear a trace of trembling in his voice. "Marksman unit, kill." The charging orcs were already very scattered, and it would be a waste to carry out a blanket attack. Originally, the remaining few hundred orcs should have been handled by the infantrymen. A strong sense of crisis made Kale, give the order to finish off the orcs. Unfortunately, his marksman unit had embarrassed him. Marksmen were elites among the rangers. Due to political reasons, the rangers of the Windrunner family were not qualified to enter the Royal Marksman unit. Their archery was indeed outstanding, but in reality, not many of them had experienced actual combat. They encountered orcs who continued to roar and charge even though many of their companions had died. Due to various subjective and objective reasons, many marksmen shot the orcs, but they did not hit the vital parts. Kale, saw with his own eyes an orc with 3 arrows in his cheek, who looked like a porcupine. Even though he was covered in blood, he still killed his way to the front of the elven infantrymen. There are less than 300 orcs left. There should be no problem, right? Kale, said to himself. What happened next almost scared him out of his wits. The elven infantryman formation was destroyed by a mere 300 orcs. Chapter 380. In the face of the orc warriors' heavy hammers, the elven warriors instinctively raised their shields to block according to the military training rules. The orc warriors' movements were too flawed. As long as they could withstand the first blow, the elven warriors would surely be able to kill these stupid and huge monsters in the next round of counterattacks. If they could block the first blow, as if they were rammed by a rampaging rhinoceros, a terrifying force so great that even their brains were instantly numbed came crashing down. Completely unprepared, most of the elven warriors were directly sent flying backwards, knocking over their comrades behind them. Still in mid-air, the elves next to them could already see that the victim's left arm was unnaturally twisted. There were at least 10 places on the victim's arm that were bent, and a good arm had suddenly become like a snake. Needless to say, it was a completely comminuted fracture caused by the tremendous force. It didn't matter if the orc warriors were chopping, lifting, or sweeping. Every heavy blow was bound to send at least one elven warrior and his armor flying into the air. That kind of violent power easily exceeded the elven's closed and poor imagination. The orcs, who had entered melee combat, were on a killing spree. More than 200 huge holes immediately appeared on the entire front line. Baron Segunar, who had just argued with Aurelia, was on the front line. He himself was hit by an orc's heavy hammer on his shield, but a powerful force far beyond his own saved his life. Even though he managed to withstand it, there was still a burning sensation in his left arm was strained. But his adjutant next to him wasn't so lucky. Even his shield was directly broken into 3 pieces. The orc directly smashed his adjutant's brains with a backhand hammer. Segunar, whose face was covered in dirt, barely managed to deal with the orc in front of him with a single sword strike, but he suddenly found that there was no one around him. He glanced around and couldn't help but feel sad. More than 50 elven warriors around him had been crippled by a single round of attacks from a mere 10 dead orcs. Although only a dozen or so had actually died in battle, the rest either had broken arms and could no longer fight, or were directly scared silly. They wouldn't be able to participate in battle for a while. Not to mention that more orcs were rushing out of the fog at this time. Cover fire. Don't stop. Kale, that's order was as strict as a textbook. If he didn't want his vanguard to collapse, it was necessary to temporarily suppress the enemy's offensive. In theory, the flames that could destroy all armed forces in the world descended once again, roasting the earth and burning the enemies that rushed out. However, not a single enemy fell. This was because these enemies had bodies that were even bigger and sturdier than the orcs. They had 2 heads and a few dazzling defensive spells. Fire Protection was able to absorb fire damage. Ice Shield, that could absorb all damage. Magic Suppression, which reduced magic damage and healing. If he said that this wasn't targeted, he would be lying to a fool. These gigantic monsters that could fight, resist, and cast magic were taking heavy steps that could shake the earth. They cast all sorts of instant cast magic against the elven mages while rapidly approaching the elven infantry, which was already on the verge of collapsing. Kale, that's face turned green. Order the arcane automatons and mountain giants to charge. At this point in the battle, Kale, that's felt very aggrieved. He had no choice but to invest the High Elves' land ace in advance. Using arcane automatons as guards had always been Silvermoon City's policy. This could make up for the lack of melee ability of the elves. The mountain giants, on the other hand, were different. Strictly speaking, the mountain giants were recruited after the great druid of the night elves communicated with the mountain giants and obtained their approval. As the high elves were exiled, the current Kuel Salis basically lost contact with the mountain giants. These 10 mountain giants were recruited with the help of a few druids who were willing to follow the high elves to the Lordaeron continent. They could be said to be the elves' treasures. Now Kale, that's had no choice but to play this hand in advance. The appearance of the mountain giants was undoubtedly very shocking. They had a humanoid form, a huge height of more than 30 meters, and their entire bodies were made of granite. Their arms alone were as thick as a carriage. In addition, their petrified skin was enough to withstand most cold weapons and their magic resistance was not weak. This kind of elemental creature was definitely worthy of being called a war machine. The mountain giant easily attracted the tribe's attention with a huge tree trunk as a weapon. The tribe immediately sent out a response weapon. Golems. Compared to this terrifying creature, which was almost at the top of the food chain in Draenor, the already terrifying ogres that were 4 or 5 meters tall were just inferior versions of golems. With a distinct inverted triangular body, a height of more than 10 meters, at least twice the speed and strength of the mountain giants, the appearance of golems completely tipped the scales of victory in the tribe's favor. Under the siege of a few golems, the powerful mountain giants were finished in less than 3 minutes. Not to mention the shorter and slower arcane automatons. The entire elven frontline formation had been completely destroyed. At this time, Orgrim raised the hammer of destruction, and a majestic orc picked up the huge horn that hung from the podium to the ground, gathered all the air in his lungs, and blew on it. A deep and loud battle cry pierced through the entire battlefield. In the next instant, countless heavily armed orc soldiers charged out of the fog. They were different from the orcs who were equipped like beggars. These orcs were armed to the teeth. They were clad in heavy black armor and had black helmets on their heads. The horn-shaped spikes on their shoulder plates pointed to the sky. They had a few small axes hanging on their waists, a fan-shaped shield in one hand, and a huge double-edged battle axe or war hammer in the other. Their heavy leg armor and iron shoes stepped on the verdant grassland, each step leaving a deep footprint, and the clanking sound of metal equipment as they ran became one. There was no formation, only the momentum of a rushing river. Like rivers converging into an ocean, countless elite orc soldiers gathered into a torrent of steel, like marching ants, filling up all the gaps in that's field of vision. They appeared all over the mountains and plains, like a tsunami on the surface of the sea when a storm rolled up. The huge wave easily destroyed everything that blocked its way along the way. No, with Prince that's lament, almost all the strong men around him had consciously joined the front line, trying to stabilize this collapsing front line. Chapter 381. At this time, the high elven mages were being suppressed by the two-headed ogre mages. The two-headed ogres, who were born with multiple casting abilities, were terrifying. Anyone who tried it would feel good. This wasn't a matter of 1 + 1 = 2. This was the collapse of an elf dealing with a twin mage who had completely surpassed the concept of telepathy. Not only did the two heads cast spells at the same time, they were also smart enough to use fire or ice magic to hit you, while the other used physical attacks like earth spikes. With multiple attributes and perfect coordination, they could often suppress 3 or 4 elven mages of the same level, making them unable to attack the main orc force. The spellbreakers, who were proficient in disrupting the opponent's spellcasting, were not very effective when they reached the front. This was because the two-headed ogre mages cast spells at the same time with 2 different sets of magic circuits. A spellbreaker could only block 1 set of circuits at a time. Unfortunately, those perverts could use more than 1 set of circuits. As a result, the effect of the spellbreaker was very poor. They could only reduce the enemy's combat power by less than 30%. Sharpshooters could indeed shoot arrows into the orc warriors' vitals through the gaps between the metal cans, but there were too few true sharpshooters. Even if a few orcs fell occasionally, the orcs behind them would instantly fill the gap. The elven blade throwers also wildly poured out triangular boomerangs. As long as they hit, they would definitely plow a path of blood among the orcs. The problem was that many elite orc captains were mixed in with the charging troops. Many of the more powerful fellows could even use heavy weapons to deflect the boomerangs shot by the blade throwers. At this moment, and the high-level elves finally understood what Aurelia meant by the green tide. The enemies in front of them seemed endless, giving them a sense of helplessness as if they couldn't kill all of them. At this moment, the Red Dragon army led by the Roaring Dragon orcs charged out from the huge fog. The orc armored infantry covered the mountains and plains, easily drowning the elven infantry formation. The elves' gorgeous but thin armor exploded in mid-air as their owners were sent flying. The troll throwers, who were armed with metal spears and had long since upgraded their shotguns to cannons, easily killed the precious spell breakers of Silver Moon City with their spears, which had become much more powerful. The spell breaker's slender kite shield was too small and fragile in the storm of spears. The unstoppable two-headed ogre charged at the front lines, using unimaginable strength and agility that surpassed the concept of ogres, swiftly dismantling the arcane constructs into scraps of components. The mountain giants roared, but their clumsy movements had no effect on Gollin, whose strength was not much inferior to theirs, and whose agility was a notch higher. Each Goron had an orc sitting on a chair nailed to the Goron's back, using chains to control the Goron's movements. The chains were connected to a series of iron rings embedded in Gerald's arms. It was cruel, bloody, but effective. As long as the chains were pulled, the half-tamed Gerald would know to turn or dodge. Unless there was an elven ranger who could shoot down the drivers, these enslaved Gollins were the most terrifying war machines. However, this was not easy. Every driver was an orc from a small clan who had been strengthened by the storm altar. They often had wind shields on them. Arrows that were shot directly were bound to be deflected by the strong wind. This was a war where they were suppressed in all aspects. In almost every aspect, the elves were suppressed by the horde. In the middle of the battlefield, there was an elven flag that was particularly eye-catching. On a red background, there was a golden flame. It was the Eternal Flame Legion. This was the first infantry regiment established by the High Elves after they came east from Kalimdor. It had participated in the Founding War, the first defense of Silver Moon City, and the Troll War 3,000 years ago. Back then, even when facing the terrifying First Legion of the Amani Troll Empire, the arrogant troll elites who outnumbered them 3-1, they still suffered defeat in front of them. Back then, the founding king of Kuel Salis, Dasmare Sunstrider, had said that this was an army that had truly inherited the pioneering spirit of Quell Dorii, the High Elves, and was forged with iron will. With an undying fighting spirit, they could definitely fight to the last soldier on the battlefield. But now, this army was almost completely wiped out. When the left and right wings began to collapse, none of the elves among them ran away. They didn't lose to willpower. Instead, they, who were still fighting in the old world, had lost to the new era. They had lost to the stronger and better equipped Blackrock clan army. The few remaining flags did not last long in the green tide. In the blink of an eye, they were completely submerged. Kale, who was on the command platform, collapsed on the spot when he saw an orc raise the broken Eternal Flame War flag high up. His pale lips muttered, "It's over. It's over. Everything is over." For his expedition, the Eternal Flame Legion that his father had temporarily transferred to him had actually been completely wiped out in less than 10 minutes in the battle against the Horde. How could he have the face to go back and see his father? The Legion had been completely wiped out, and the war flag had been taken. Anyone who had a slight understanding of the High Elves' military system would understand. The Eternal Flame Legion had completely disappeared from this reality. Its former prestige and all of its glorious history had been taken away by the orcs. In this moment of humiliation, it had completely disappeared from this land. Kale, had almost succeeded in committing suicide. A graceful female mage threw herself at Kale, She was the great astromancer Solarian, a loyal supporter of Prince Kale, Your Highness. Retreat first. Kuel Salis can't live without you. Otherwise, the royal blood will be severed. Let's retreat first and win it back later. More loyal Kale, pounced forward and held Kale, back. When Kale, waved the retreat flag on the command platform, the entire elven front line collapsed like an avalanche. The elves cried and wailed. They threw away all their weapons and equipment, turned around, and ran. The greatest taboo on the battlefield was to collapse. Especially when the opponent's speed was no less than their own, collapsing was a nightmare. The orcs laughed and smashed the remaining elves into meat paste. The trolls laughed maniacally and nailed slender elves to the ground with the metal spears provided by the orcs. Looking at the dying elves who were struggling and twisting on the ground like frogs waiting to be dissected, the trolls vented the hatred that had accumulated for thousands of years. The murderous trolls naturally continued to chase the elves, while the psychopathic trolls began the most inhumane killing. They slowly tore these handsome men and beautiful women into pieces. Chapter 382. Yes. The trolls used their hook-like fingers, huge palms, and powerful arms to tear off the flesh of the elves piece by piece. Accompanied by the endless wails of despair and pain was the twisted, hearty laughter of the trolls. The beautifully carved armor could not withstand a blow from the heavy weapons of the orcs. Gorgeous magic could not destroy the enemies that came at them like a tide. Terrified, the mages tore open their magic robes so that they could run faster. Kale, that's even heard a noble female elf mage beg a chocobo cavalryman to take her with him. She was even willing to give up everything for this. In the end, all she got was a lifetime of cold and selfish sneer. Kale, that's did not retreat immediately. He activated all the magic circuits in his body and frantically threw long-distance fireballs at the densest part of the battlefield. As a radiant moon mage, the power of his rage was quite astonishing. The continuous fireballs formed a small belt of fire, blocking a considerable portion of the orcs' advance. In the past, Kale, that's actions would have been enough to win him a round of applause. There were no cheers, no praises. None of the elves saved by Kale, that's dared to look up at their prince. They all lowered their heads and ran wildly. However, when an even larger two-headed ogre mage appeared and used magic that was not inferior to Kale, that's magic to shoot at him, the situation took a turn for the worse. On this day, the undefeatable legend of the two-headed ogre mage was branded in the hearts of the proud high elves for the first time. Faster casting speed, higher density of elemental particles, and more perfect coordination. Fighting with a two-handed ogre mage felt no different from fighting a team of experienced mages of the same level. Your Highness. Let's go. Astromancer Caponia used her fire magic to share Kale, that's burden. Baron Saguna, who had rushed back from the front lines, used his powerful arm strength to drag Kale, that's away. Kale, that's did not want to leave. He wanted to be the one to bring up the rear. But everything was over. His army collapsed like a landslide. In the distance, on the black land that had been scorched by the fire, the pale stone limbs of the mountain giants were scattered all over the ground. These enormous guardian spirits that the elves had to look up to at all times were now crawling in the middle of the battlefield as if they were in a deep sleep. The sleeping mountain giant was no different from a small hill. Kale that's knew that it had fallen asleep forever. He recognized this mountain giant. When he was very young, when he was officially declared the crown prince by his father had personally awakened this giant named Little. He still remembered how gentle Xiao Xiao was. She didn't even want to disturb the birds that were nesting on her. After the elves moved all the nests away, they happily carried him around the edge of the Long Song forest, even though he was still young. He still remembered how insufferably arrogant he looked when he stood on Xiao Xiao's body. He told himself, I will become the king of this land, and Xiao Xiao will be my moving castle. At that time, he felt that Xiao Xiao was so powerful and impossible to defeat. But now, after being attacked countless times by the huge and ferocious Gorons with their huge claws covered in steel, Xiao Xiao finally lost all signs of life and aura. Xiao Xiao was no longer a powerful elemental creature. It returned to the origin of Mother Earth and became a pile of stones again. Mountain giant Xiao Xiao, no, Kale that's cried. The eastern temple was clearly behind him, and the distance of 2,000 meters would normally be covered in a short walk. But such a short distance was completely covered by the high elves. On the battlefield, Orgrim rode a tall wolf and found Zhu Jin, who was covered in blood. Zhu Jin. How is it? Doesn't it feel good to be a brother of the beastmen? Ha ha ha. Orgrim laughed boldly. Zhu Jin, who was covered in blood, stuck out his long tongue and licked the elven flesh on his fangs. He revealed an extremely satisfied grin. The taste of revenge is great. My great chief, but it's not enough. This is not enough to vent the hatred of the Amani Empire for 6,000 years. Only with the destruction of Silvery Moon and the extinction of the High Elves can the souls of the tens of thousands of angry great demons rest in peace. Orgrim patted Zhu Jin's shoulder. Then what are you waiting for? Follow me. If you're too slow, don't complain that the beast men didn't leave a few living elves for you. Ha ha ha. Looking at Orgrim's back, Zhu Jin showed a rare expression of admiration. He whistled and summoned his velociraptor mount, catching up with large strides. Prince Kael'thas had almost died for his country. Before he reached the defensive range of the Eastern Temple, he was caught up by the tribal heroes led by Gujar. The chief of the Shattered Palm clan, Kargath Blade Fist, had been summoned by Gul Dan using a teleportation spell. He used his frenzied and fast slashes to beat Sagunnar like a dog. Gujar used his advantage of two-headed combo attacks to easily suppress Kael'thas by himself. The chief of the Dragon Maw clan, Zuluhid, suppressed the two Astromancers, Caponia and Solarian, by himself. Kael'thas' subordinate, Saladre, was being beaten to a pulp by a sword saint of the Fireblade clan. It was only a matter of time before he died. At this moment, the arrows came. The mysterious and shadowless fierce wind arrow. The domineering lightning arrow. The two arrows had completely different feelings. They clearly came from the hands of two female elves wearing green capes, but it made people feel as if they had mobilized two armies of archers. The overwhelming pressure made it hard for the heroes of the tribe to breathe. A beastman driver tried to have a Golan attack the two elves. Who knew that with just one arrow, the huge Golan's head and the driver's head on its back would both be shot in the head? The scene of two heads, one big and one small, exploding like rotten watermelons was shocking. It had to be known that the archer was still 300 meters away. Your Highness. Please retreat. It was Aurelia Windrunner's voice. Kael'thas was ashamed. He brought his companions and retreated with his tail between his legs. Even though he left behind a "thank you," he could not hide his embarrassment. That night, the tribe used a huge metal wheel that was as tall as a 7-story building as a siege vehicle. It withstood the bombardment of the magic equipment on the temple and forced the battle into hand-to-hand combat. After 3 hours of fighting, the Eastern Temple's defense line fell. On the second day after Kael'thas escaped back to Silvermoon City, the triumphant council thought that they had finally found a chance to attack the royal family. They criticized Kael'thas for his poor command, causing the death of 20,000 elite high elves in battle. At the same time, they issued a motion to restrict the royal power and announced that the Pillars of the High Elves, formed by the private soldiers and high-level mages of the council, would personally kill all the invaders in the Long Song Forest. However, a day later, the bad news of the destruction of the 40,000 High Elves army came. The High Elves were in a desperate situation. Chapter 383. Sun King Anastrian's heart was bleeding. Prince Kael'thas' heart was bleeding. The members of the Silvermoon Council, who were usually high and mighty, all lowered their heads. Not only that, but almost every elf in the magnificent palace lowered their prideful heads. The allied forces of the orcs and trolls had already killed their way to the great Silvermoon City. The magic defense system that they were so proud of was once again broken by a warlock named Gul Dan. Looking into the distance, the Sun King's crow's feet were already dripping with tears. He still remembered that the founder of the kingdom, Disrima, had organized the High Elves to disperse and restrain the trolls while continuing to move north. After experiencing countless hardships, they found a paradise in the forest. It was a place that could maintain the bloodline of the High Elves. It was near the mountains and the sea, easy to defend and difficult to attack. The land was plentiful and the spring was beautiful. Disrima sprinkled the bottle of eternal water into a small lake here, creating another well of eternity, today's well of the sun. He named this place Kuel Salis. He named the new city Silvermoon City and personally drew up the architectural blueprint of Silvermoon City, retaining the luxurious and aesthetic architectural style of the High Elves. In order to distinguish themselves from his compatriots who stayed in Kalimdor, and to always remember their former noble identity, Disrima renamed the High Elves who moved to Kuel Salis Quel, Dorii, High Elves, implying that, we are no longer the nobles of the lower races, but have higher intelligence and have since broken away from the Kadorii clan that their ancestors used for generations. Before Silvermoon City was completely completed, the High Elves who had obtained a new life couldn't wait to support Disrima as king. Yes, they needed a king, a strong person who could control the overall situation. Disrima was undoubtedly the most suitable choice. He was brave, decisive, ambitious, tolerant, yet cunning, agile, cold, and proud. All the qualities that a king should have could be found in him without exception, and even more valuable qualities could be found. He was the first king of Kuel Salis, Disrima Sunstrider. This was the origin of the Sunstrider royal family. In the Troll War that lasted thousands of years, the High Elves were almost wiped out. At that time, the successor of the royal family, Anastrian, personally made the decision to ask the humans for help. For 2,800 years, the Silvermoon Parliament had always used the reason that the king had given in too much to the humans to attack the king and fight for more power. At this moment, the Sun King, who was sitting on the supreme throne, did not say a word, and his sharp eyes swept across the Silvermoon councillors one by one. Every member of Parliament felt their scalps go numb. The Sun King turned around slightly. His red robe with golden edges was like the rising sun swallowing the darkness. He moved on the throne, and his pale but still powerful hand held the golden phoenix scepter tightly. The scepter still reflected the glory of the palace, blooming with a golden luster like the sun. His pale face had lost all expressions of joy, anger, sorrow, and joy. It was cold, indifferent, and calm. The voice of the Sun King finally sounded in the hall. Councillors of the Silver Moon Council, when I asked for your help as the king, you only gave my son a mediocre army to fight against the brutal orcs. You have the best elites you can imagine in your hands. If my son's failure was exchanged for your success, it would be a victory for the High Elves, after all. But now, how are you going to repay me for my concession? The Sun King imitated the voice of the former Silvermoon Council president. We have General Phoenix. The next moment, the Sun King's voice was replaced by the terrified cry of the messenger. Your Majesty, bad news. Phoenix was killed by the Orc chief, Liker. The voice changed again. We have Arcane Master Rusfang. Your Majesty, bad news again. Master Rusfang was killed by the two-headed ogre, Gujar. Every time the Sun King changed his voice, it was like a huge slap on the faces of the remaining Silvermoon councillors. Every councillor's face was burning, and they could not help but lower their heads. Finally, a councillor could not help but say, Your Majesty, we can actually ask for help from the humans, if you want to go to the Silvermoon Council. I was scolded by you for 2,800 years because I asked for help back then. This time, if you don't go, then the bloodline of the Sunstrider royal family will end in Silvermoon City. Your Majesty. In the hall, almost every high elf noble exclaimed. The king had nothing to lose and was determined to hang on to the end. After all, there were less than 30,000 soldiers left in Silvermoon City. Although they could organize people with combat power to defend, rushing into battle was no different from killing the goose that laid the golden eggs. It seemed that Silvermoon City could not be defended by the elves alone. If Silvermoon City was breached, no one would have a good ending. They would definitely not be able to return to the Kalimdor continent. There would be no place for the high elves on this continent that was full of smoke and flames of war. Cold sweat soaked the backs of all the councillors. No. Your Majesty, please think carefully. The councillors shouted. The Sun King seemed to have lost his hearing. He sat on the throne like an ice sculpture, not saying a word. Just like that, he quietly watched the commotion below. Kale, that's wanted to say something, but in the end, his body trembled violently and he stopped moving. At this moment, a large group of nobles and counselors finally thought of an elf. One who had been ignored by all the elves because she had an affair with a foreign race, and one who had learned about the invasion of the tribe early on but did not attract the attention of the higher-ups. She was an elf who still stood in the hall with her head held high, Aurelia Windrunner. Countless pairs of eyes looked at the female ranger general who stood at the end of the hall. Yes. It was in this moment of despair that they remembered this heroine who had always been bold and outspoken but was rejected by the mainstream authorities. Cervantes, who had been standing quietly beside Aurelia, suddenly raised his head and said in the whisper of the wind that outsiders could not hear, "Sister. We must not be soft-hearted to these bastards. If we don't cut off these rotten meat, Quo Salus will perish sooner or later." A counselor who had once been high and mighty walked in front of Aurelia and said in an almost flattering tone, "Madam Aurelia, regarding the siege of Silvermoon City, the council would like to know your opinion." Agitated. Angry. Resentful about why the high elves kept so many parasites. Roaring about why the higher-ups were not willing to listen to any pertinent opinions. But when the higher-ups really condescended to listen to her opinion, Aurelia felt a wave of indifference. That's right, it was a kind of indifference that came from a dead heart. "I have no opinion," Aurelia replied calmly. Chapter 384. Didn't Aurelia love Quo Salus? Wrong. She loved her country more than any other elf. As the saying went, the deeper the love, the deeper the hatred. The first time Duque had informed her, she had rushed back to warn the tribe when they were far away in the hinterlands. She had been ignored. She had even been given the roaring parliament's high hat. The second time she had barged into the Silvermoon Parliament when the runestone magic circle was broken. There seemed to be some progress, but she immediately realized that the Sun King and the Parliament were still bickering for power when the enemy was right in front of them. A group of higher-ups who had never been willing to understand their enemy had pulled out a small team of trump cards and miscellaneous people, and they had delusions of defeating the well-prepared elite army of 100,000 tribes. Without a doubt, Prince Kale, that's first expedition brought the most terrible consequences. Then, the Parliament tried to stand out, and with the goal of suppressing the royal family's party, they also didn't want to understand their enemy, so they went to deliver food to Orgrim and Zugine. The royal family's army of 25,000 was defeated, and less than 5,000 returned. The 40,000 Parliament's elite troops were all annihilated, and less than 400 returned. In addition to the guards lost at the border, more than 70,000 high elves died in battle in a short week. If you added the civilians who couldn't retreat in time, it was 150,000. The high elves couldn't compare to humans in terms of population. In contrast to their long lifespan, they had a low fertility rate. The high elves generally didn't like to raise their offspring too early. It wasn't unusual for a generation to occur every 1,000 years. This caused the total population of the high elves to never exceed 1 million. How much money did the high elves have to waste? Aurelia had cried, begged, felt sad, and felt hopeless. Even though Duque had warned her time and time again that the higher-ups of Silvermoon City were a bunch of bastards who didn't care about the lives of the people and held each other back for power. Before experiencing all of this, Aurelia had always had a trace of hope and longing for the Sun King and the Parliament. Until this moment, the cruel reality showed her that there was no end to courting death. Countless wooden stakes were erected in the open space outside Silvermoon City, each with a dead elf stuck in it. Every 15 minutes outside the city, a group of elves would be beheaded by the cruel trolls as they wailed in despair. Aurelia finally gave up on the Sunstrider royal family and the Silvermoon Council. Unexpectedly, when they were at the end of their rope, this group of fellows, who were like rats trying to escape from a sinking ship, suddenly remembered Duque's army. The elite troops that had been waiting at the border since the beginning were strictly forbidden from entering. The reinforcements that Aurelia had pulled over at all costs. Aurelia's cold reply was a challenge to the hearts of the counselors. After playing the political game for thousands of years, these counselors had long since developed a way to deal with almost any situation. Agreeing was not the same as agreeing completely. He refused because the price was too low. He firmly refused because the price was ridiculously low. These counselors, who had spent their entire lives in the political game, were most afraid of encountering this kind of complete disregard. The other party refused to communicate with you, which in itself meant that there was no need to talk. It was only then that the counselors remembered that Duque had sent a liaison officer to Silverymoon City. They quickly gave up on Illyria, who was a tough nut to crack, and turned their attention to the diplomat who was just as young. Ilusia Berov, the eldest daughter of the Alterac aristocrat Duke Berov's family, and the student of the Alliance's deputy commander, Gambler Marcus. This qualification would not be ignored in front of the king of any human kingdom. Only the arrogant elves would dare to leave her in the state guesthouse and ignore her for a full 10 days. The only problem was that this Miss Berov had the same shocking age as her master. She was only 16 years old this year. 16 years old might be an age that was easy to induce, but 16 years old could also be a time bomb, because youth represented impulsiveness. Just the thought of a hothead with a great weapon of mass destruction made every politician's scalp tingle. This was because all the predictions of their thinking patterns and adult rules might not necessarily apply to such people. They worried too much. Ilusia, who had been ignored for 10 days, did not feel any excitement, anger, or joy, because Duque had told her that she might be treated like this. In fact, Duque did not want a young lady like Ilusia to suffer in the military camp. Even if mages always received the best treatment, it would never be as comfortable as the Dalijan or her home, Caer Daren. Ilusia had an audience with the king. She was dressed impeccably. She had a head full of beautiful black hair, a perfectly fitted forehead ornament and necklace, and a set of elegant blue mage robes. She had the air of a quiet lady. Even the high elves, who were extremely picky about their clothes and appearance, could not find fault with Ilusia at all. Ilusia Berov, disciple of Grand Duke Marcus of Stormwind City, greets the Sun King and the counselors of the Silvermoon Council. The almost formal greeting did not reveal any information. The Sun King nodded. The Silvermoon Council has something to discuss with you. With that, he closed his eyes and remained motionless as if he had been hit by a petrifying spell. Councillor Morlens was now the acting chairman. This high and mighty radiant moon mage bit the bullet and stepped out. He said to Ilusia, "To be honest, Kuel Salis is currently in a bit of a predicament. The Silvermoon Council would like to express their gratitude to Grand Duke Marcus for taking the initiative to come to their aid. Now, we would like to discuss if the Lordaeron Alliance is willing to start negotiations for new members." Ilusia's first words almost choked Morlens to death. "I can only represent the opinion of Grand Duke Marcus, not the Lordaeron Alliance. If you have something to discuss with the Alliance, I suggest that you look for the chief commander of the Alliance, Lord Lothar, or the most influential king in the Alliance, His Majesty Menethil." This was clearly making things difficult for them. Everyone knew that Lothar and King Menethil were fighting anxiously in the Silverpine Forest. They could barely take care of themselves. Who would care about Kuel Salis, who was far away and had given the Alliance enough face in the past? The only thing they could count on was Duque, the deputy commander of the Alliance, and his troops. The group of counselors was beaten to the point of vomiting blood by Ilusia's Tai Chi. Morlens had no choice but to ask, "What if the Silvermoon Council wishes to have a face-to-face formal meeting with Sir Marcus?" "Sure. But as the price for treating my teacher coldly, there must be an additional condition." Chapter 385. Their lives were in the other party's hands, and they had to bow their heads. Even if they knew that taking the initiative to ask was handing over the initiative, did the elves still have the initiative to speak of? Morlens could only ask on behalf of Speaker, what conditions? Ilusia smiled brilliantly, her smile like thousands of flowers blooming at the same time, but the content of her words embarrassed every elf to the extreme. Their faces were covered with shame and anger, because she said, "Please spread the red carpet from the Travelers' Square all the way to the Tower of Sunfury. At the same time, open all the main doors from the square to the Sun-Chasing King Court, and then to the Tower of Sunfury. Welcome, my teacher." The speaker almost bit his tongue off. Even the human kings had never received such treatment. There had only been 2 such grand welcoming ceremonies in the entire history of Silvery Moon. One was the first entry ceremony after Silvery Moon was built. Thousands of elves welcomed the first elven king, Darima Sunstrider, with flowers and cheers. This was to celebrate his success in finally leading the people to establish a country in this strange land. The other was after the victory over the trolls, when Silvery Moon held a triumphant ceremony for Anastrian Sunstrider, the highest hero in the hearts of the people at that time. Such a grand welcoming ceremony, the proud elves would never hold such a grand ceremony for any outsider. Now that Alucia mentioned it, Morlens screamed on the spot. This is impossible. What right does Marcus have to enjoy such a grand treatment? Why? Teacher is the hero of the world of Azeroth who can kill the tribes the most. 50,000 in the Elven Forest. 100,000 in Stormwind City. 100,000 in the first Battle of Southshore. 100,000 in the Battle of Paladin. 100,000 in the second Battle of Southshore. 50,000 in the Battle of Earthy Highlands. A total of 500,000 tribes were kicked into hell by Teacher to repent for their sins. Isn't that enough? Alucia proudly raised her head. If she only gave people the feeling of a lady just now she was a high and mighty god overlooking all life. Admittedly, this battle record was more or less exaggerated. It was an indisputable fact that Duque personally commanded these battles as the Alliance's deputy commander, and it was not wrong to put the battle record on Duque's head. The enemy's enemy is my hero. Just based on the number of beasts killed, Duque was worthy of this courtesy. Morlens was speechless for a moment. After a long time, he said, "The High Elves have never opened the gate of the Sunstrider royal court for a foreign hero. Then there's nothing to talk about." Alucia said firmly. What she was doing was not the kind of, "Are you going to lower the price or not?" like buying vegetables in the market. "If you don't bargain, I'll leave." It was obviously a pretentious negotiation method. Alucia responded to Morlens with a mocking sneer. She turned around elegantly, her long hair flying in the air in a beautiful arc. Then, without moving her shoulders, she strode out of the hall gracefully and firmly. Clean, efficient, and without any leeway. Chairman Morlens, who had been through countless negotiations, was dumbfounded. He really wanted to believe that Alucia was faking it. But no matter from Aluxia's heartbeat, breath, or expression, Aluxia was taking pleasure in others' misfortune. He was right. All the counselors in the hall, the Sun King, and Prince Kale, had guessed correctly. Alucia and Duque, who was behind her, really did not care about the life and death of the elves. Duque's last command echoed in Alucia's mind. "The only thing I care about is the Windrunner sisters. Not because of personal relationships, but because of the special value they possess. As for the elves, if they are still so arrogant and look down on others at the moment when their city is about to be destroyed, then let them drown with their ridiculous arrogance." What did the High Elves' extinction have to do with Alucia? After Duque announced that they could win this battle without the elves, Alucia was even more confident. This was not a political tactic, but a true sense of indifference. 1 step, 2 steps, 10 steps, 20 steps, with every step Alucia took, her light and graceful footsteps made the hearts of the counselors sink. The situation seemed to have returned to 2,800 years ago, when the elves were about to be wiped out. Humans could live without the elves. But the elves could not live without the help of humans. After losing 2 battles in a row, and with the Horde at their gates, the High Elves were no longer the transcendent race that could sit on their own side and watch the other races fight to the death. A fallen phoenix was no better than a chicken. Now, Quel Salis was that chicken. Aurelia, who had the best relationship with Duque, was disheartened. The counselor's attempts to get her out of the way were met with indifference. The way to make it public was about to be blocked. It would be strange if the counselors were not anxious. The Sunstrider royal family, who should have been the most restless, was determined to bury Silvermoon City with them. The Sun King and Kale, that's both had a dead look on their faces. The counselors were as anxious as ants on a hot pan. If there was absolute evidence that Aurelia was Duque's woman, perhaps the counselors would even do something like kidnapping and blackmailing. But that was just wishful thinking. No matter how weak the Windrunner family was, they were still the leader of the Rangers. If they made a move on Aurelia now, wouldn't all the most useful Rangers in the defense of the city turn traitor? Unknowingly, Elucia had already walked to the door of the hall. She said calmly, "Please open the teleportation circle outside the council hall. I will leave now and return to my teacher." The guard captain at the door was in a dilemma. He did not know whether to agree or not. He could not say a single word for a long time. At this moment, all the counselors in the hall cast their murderous gazes on Morlens. If gazes were swords, Morlens would have been stabbed countless times and lying in a pool of blood. Taking one last look at the Sun King, who was determined to die for his country, Morlens knew that if he let Elucia go, he would not live to see tomorrow's morning sun. Once it was dark, he would be cut into pieces and thrown out of the city to be fed to the ogres. "Miss Barev, please stay. The Silvermoon Council is willing to initiate a motion to request the Sun King, an Astrian Sunstrider, to agree to open the main gate of the Sunstrider court and welcome the arrival of the Alliance's hero, His Excellency Duke Marcus. Counselors, those who agree with this motion, please raise your hand." Morlens stared fiercely at the counselors behind him. "All right, you bastards are forcing me to lose face, aren't you? If you want to lose face, I'll lose it together. I'll deal with whoever disagrees first." What was the result? Of course, it was unanimously approved. The Sun King, an Astrian, finally opened his murky eyes. "Since this is an official motion of the Silvermoon Council, for the continuation of Kuel Salis, I agree." All right, the biggest obstacle had been cleared. With a victorious expression on her face, Elucia connected to Duke's magical communication and informed him of what had happened here. Unexpectedly, Duque's words choked all the elves present. "Negotiation? I'm not free." Chapter 386. Aren't you high elves so arrogant? Aren't you elves cold and aloof, like you're the best in the world and everyone owes you money? For Aurelia's sake, I've come all the way here, but I've been left outside your borders to eat dust. This feels so good. All right. You don't listen. You don't understand. You know but don't do it. You can't do it well. I sent you reinforcements, but you don't use them. You have to use your precious troops to send food. Are you King Sun King and the Silvermoon Council courting death? As a transmigrator, Duque didn't have much resentment towards the High Elves. But when Duque truly experienced the arrogant and domineering temperament of the High Elves, Duque said, "I don't want to serve you anymore." Now that Duque said, "I'm not free," the High Elves were furious. "I'm finally willing to serve you with the highest treatment, and you're saying you're not free?" This time, even Prince Kale, that's eyelids twitched a few times. If he was just putting on airs, Duque was undoubtedly going overboard. Of course, Duque wasn't that stupid. His reason was even more dignified. In the mirror image, Duke had a regretful look on his face. "Sorry, I'm sorry. I originally planned to help you deal with the main force of the great tribal chief, but I saw that Kuel Salis didn't seem to need support. On the other side, King Menethil urged me more than 10 times to help deal with the tribal division that was causing destruction near Daroshir. So, I transferred the 30,000-strong army away." With that, Duque turned the camera to show the scene of a fierce battle all over the mountains and plains. It wasn't actually a fierce battle. The elves noticed that the humans had gained the absolute upper hand. The human soldiers were methodically surrounding and annihilating the tribes. Considering that Duque was the deputy commander of the alliance, it was completely reasonable for him to deal with the tribes in the territories of the alliance first. Who told the High Elves not to join the alliance? At this moment, all the counselors felt so regretful that their intestines turned green. Countless resentful gazes turned towards the Silvermoon counselor Dalcan, who had given the 8 countries a hard time. Everyone knew that Duque was trying to get back at him. He was forcing the High Elves to choose between pride and riches. In fact, there wasn't much to choose from. Moral integrity was something that could easily be lost after it had been lost once. 2,800 years ago, the elves sought help from the humans and had no choice but to teach them magic in exchange for the humans' support. 2,800 years later, the elves would only lose their moral integrity once more. Now that the Silver Moon Council had admitted defeat, the Sun King would not exterminate the Silver Moon Council when they were in urgent need of manpower in front of the enemy. Even if they were the worst political enemies, their power as archmages would still come in handy when the enemy was at the gates. The Sun King winked at his son. Kale, that's immediately stepped forward. Duque, the High Elves need your help. Could I trouble you to come to Silvermoon City as soon as possible? As he said this, Kale, that's looked at Aurelia, who was standing at the end of the hall. The eyes of this gentle and elegant prince were full of pleading. He was going to play the emotional card. If it were someone else, Aurelia would definitely not care. But not Kale, that's. Back then, Aurelia had given Duque the mage apprentice's notebook that belonged to Kale, that's. She had been sentenced to 3 months because of Kale, that's pleading. Otherwise, with the political influence of the Windrunner family, she would have been sentenced to 1 year at best, or 3 years in prison at worst. Aurelia's mouth moved slightly, and a breeze quietly drifted to Elucia's ear. Elucia immediately understood. She did not do anything but let the camera shine on Aurelia. Duque understood on the spot. All right, when I've dealt with the leader of this division, I'll come over as soon as possible. When Duque said this, the head of the leader of this division, General Nogjar, was right next to Duque's hand. In the original trajectory of history, if Nogjar had been allowed to continue growing, perhaps he would have become a famous tribal hero. Unfortunately, his opponent was Duque. After learning that the annihilation of Hindlands had ended, Duque immediately left an empty camp with less than 300 people outside the Elven Kingdom's border. The main force immediately turned around and joined up with Seamus' division. Cudrin Wildhammer was also very generous. Ever since the pinnacle battle at the wine table, Cudrin personally brought the entire Griffin Knight regiment. The Air Force regiment seemed to be a little smaller in terms of numbers, with only 1,000 riders. But considering the terrifying combat power of an adult Griffin that could easily take out 20 infantrymen without panting, a Griffin Knight regiment was actually no less than the combat power of 50,000 people. Apart from that, Cudrin also supported a heavy infantry regiment of 3,000 people from the Eagle Nest Mountain. This time, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that Cudrin had emptied his entire base. Flying in the sky and blocking on the ground, the annihilation of this dwarven division was also reasonable. Moreover, Duque knew that Nogjar was ferocious, so he directly formed a team and killed this horde quasi-hero. Moreover, Gavin Rad, Reginald, Cudrin, and Duque, the 4 of them together, no matter how ferocious Nogjar was, he could only die in frustration. In fact, during the magic transmission, Duque even cheated. The background of the battle that the elves saw was actually a video recorded by Duque. The 60,000 troops were already stationed outside the Elven Kingdom's border. Hearing Duke's promise, the elves finally put down their hearts that were hanging in midair. That night, the elves held a national banquet, and the guests were Elucia and the 4 Windrunner sisters. If the Sun King's reward for Aurelia and the other sisters was considered normal, then the council was blatantly bribing them. 4 mansions in the Traveler's Square, 5 large ocean-going merchant ships, and more than 10 epic longbows. However, the more smiles the council put on, the colder Aurelia's heart became. Is this the high-ranking elves who control the life and death of hundreds of thousands of elves? Compared to Elusia's appropriate response, the four Windrunner sisters were like four pieces of wood, purely accompanying her. No matter what, after a preliminary exchange of conditions, Elusia finally promised to communicate with her master again later. As expected, she received an affirmative reply from Duque the day after tomorrow. The Dark Portal Year 2, 18th of June. This was a very special day for the High Elves. When the 100,000 ferocious Horde soldiers besieged the city, Silvery Moon City used the Supreme Sunchaser ceremony to welcome the arrival of a human hero, Duke Marcus. In the 6,000 years since Silvery Moon City was founded, only two heroes had received such a grand welcome. They were the first king and second king of the Sunchaser royal family. In the eyes of the extremely arrogant elves, the third person to enjoy the glory of the Sunchaser ceremony should have been Prince Kael, that's whom all the elves had high hopes for. Chapter 387. It was a pity that their prince had been beaten like a dog by the tribe in the first battle. Even though the royal family and the Silvermoon Council spared no effort in publicizing Duque's glorious achievements, every elf with a brain knew that the High Elves had failed once again, and had no choice but to seek help from the humans. Rather than saying that this was a grand welcoming ceremony for a hero, it would be more accurate to say that 100,000 elves had no choice but to witness the noble High Elves being nailed to the pillar of shame once again. The only difference was that this wasn't a humiliating surrender ceremony, but a welcoming ceremony in the name of an ally. The Sun King and the Silvermoon Council only had one last fig leaf left. They had no choice but to urgently need this fig leaf. An army of 70,000 had been destroyed, and 90% of their land had fallen. Even the most optimistic elves did not dare to hope that the High Elves could survive this crisis alone. The panicking citizens needed confidence. The despairing and suffering soldiers needed hope. These were all things that the Sun King and the Silvermoon Council could not give to their citizens and soldiers. Duque, the most powerful orc killer in Azeroth's history, the culprit behind the deaths of 500,000 orcs. His appearance was undoubtedly a boost to the morale of the Kuel Salis elves, who were on the brink of hell. Hence, Duque's arrival had undoubtedly left the elves in a dilemma. Happiness, humiliation, unease, warmth. All sorts of emotions were running through them. At 10 in the morning, the vast Traveller's Square was already tightly surrounded by elven commoners. When their king and parliament couldn't provide them with a sense of security, it was part of their survival instinct to look for a new life-saving straw. If something happened to Duque and he could not come, or if the teleportation portal was disrupted, causing the promised reinforcements to not be able to come, the elven citizens would undoubtedly sink into a deeper despair and fear. Fortunately, Duque did not stand them up. At 10 sharp, in the middle of the square, a huge circular teleportation portal that was 5 stories tall opened. Under the illumination of the sparkling arcane energy, 10 Morningstar elven wizards in uniform rapidly helped to stabilize the portal. Under the gaze of 100,000 pairs of eyes, a rare sight in Silvery Moon appeared on the other side of the portal, followed by the orderly and rhythmic sound of hooves. Huge and pure white warhorses seemed to be performing dressage, taking rhythmic steps as they stepped out of the portal. The first thing that entered the elven citizens' sight were 12 human knights in shining armor. It was clearly the Storm Kingdom's knight armor with a silver base and blue edges. Unexpectedly, the flags they held in their hands were in a mess, with all kinds of colors. At first, some ignorant citizens sneered softly. 2 seconds later, they exclaimed from the bottom of their hearts. The war flags were the war flags of the tribes. One of the war flags had the same symbol as the one used to besiege Silvermoon City. It was the war flag of the Blackrock tribe. Not only were there flags, but there were also a dozen huge orc heads frozen with ice magic. Banners written in the elven language were inserted into the ice, announcing the identities of these heads. Surprisingly, each of these heads belonged to a tribal chief. Among them, the most eye-catching were the words head of the great tribal chief Black Hand. That's right. That's right. These Alliance Knights were displaying the Alliance's achievements to the elves with the attitude of victors. They were displaying Duke's great achievements. Behind the 12 knights were the 12 Earth Wizards. As soon as they appeared, they lined up neatly on both sides, bowing at a 45-degree angle as they awaited the arrival of the most important person. Finally, there was a loud sound in the sky, and Duke made a dazzling appearance. Accompanied by the deafening thunder, Duke appeared in the teleportation portal, enveloped by a tornado formed from 5 different elements. A wriggling chain of lightning. A violently spinning gale shield. An incomparably scorching snake of flames. A bone-chilling barrier of ice. An incomparably mysterious light of arcane magic. 5 different types of power could actually blend together harmoniously, turning into 12 spinning elemental energy balls that floated above Duke's head. Duke's move directly defeated Prince Kale, who always had 3 arcane energy balls floating above his head. In fact, it was not just Kale, Acting Chairman Morlenz, who had been waiting at the side, also had an awkward expression on his face. Duke's people were invited by the Silvermoon Council on their knees. Even if the other party was obviously trying to humiliate them, the Silvermoon Council could only swallow it. Morlenz pretended not to see anything, and put on a warm face as he followed Alusia to welcome him. "Welcome, Teacher Duke. Duke, you're here. My father is already waiting for you. I am Acting Chairman Morlenz. I represent the Silvermoon Council in welcoming you, Your Excellency Grand Duke Marcus." 3 people, 3 different forms of address, but it did not seem out of place on this occasion. Duke nodded lightly to Alusia, and the eldest daughter of the Berev family obediently stood behind Duke. Then, Prince Kale, that's on the left, and Chairman Morlenz on the right, the 2 incomparably noble elves led Duke on the red carpet towards the hall where the Silvermoon Council was located. The horn sounded to welcome the guests, and thunderous applause sounded, accompanied by cheers that reached the sky. Countless petals were scattered by beautiful elven girls from the balconies of the tall buildings on both sides of the road onto the red carpet. "Welcome, the hero of mankind. Long live the beast-man killer Duke. Kuel Salis is counting on you. Sir Marcus." No matter how much of the welcome was sincere, at least at this moment, Duke received the treatment he deserved. The arrogance of the high elves that had lingered in Silvermoon City for thousands of years seemed to have transformed into the red carpet used to welcome guests, and was ruthlessly stepped on by Duke. The corner of Duke's mouth curved into a sinister smile. "Silvermoon City, here I come. As the savior of the world. If you are willing to put down your pride, then I don't mind giving you some pointers. If you are so stubborn, then don't blame me for letting you die." Various aspects of the history of the world of Azeroth appeared in Duke's mind. It could be said that since the first opening of the Dark Portal, the history of the entire world was a history of war between the Alliance and the Horde. There might be a short period of peace, but most of the time it was a state of war. Only when a stronger enemy attacked, and when they could not fight against the foreign enemy alone, would these mortal enemies quickly resolve their conflict and turn to an alliance. In history, Orgrim's troops only circled the Long Song Forest once, and then left contentedly after setting up the Storm Altar, leaving the suffering trolls to deal with the elves alone. Now, history had changed greatly. Without a doubt, the person who now controlled the fate of the High Elves was Duke. Walking on the red carpet, Duke clearly did not have a noble crown on his head. However, in the eyes of the elves, Duke was without a doubt an uncrowned king. Chapter 388. The Uncrowned King. It sounded nice, but most people would think that it was useless to not be a king. In fact, this majority was wrong. No one knew better than Duke, who was a transmigrator. Without the support of power, the title of king was even more meaningless than an empty title. If the orcs and trolls from the First and Second Wars were considered mortals, then the Third War at the Dark Portal would start. In that case, starting from the Third Battle of the Dark Portal, things like resurrection from the dead, the Calamity Army formed from the undead, dragons, elemental lords, ancient gods. When a large number of ordinary people saw these things that would make them piss their pants, everyone would know that any country that didn't have enough power to support it was nothing more than child's play. Only power. Only then would Duque be able to stand at the peak of the world's nations. Now, Duque stood there, his formless power like a storm, easily sweeping through the entire Traveller's Square. Tens of thousands of elves consciously formed a long line. Whether they were willing or not, they had to worship Duque and pray for Duque's salvation. It was as if a silent image was overlapping with history, just like the scene from 2,800 years ago. Accompanying the elven hero Anastrian Sunstrider into the city was the greatest emperor in human history, Thoradin the Great. Now, Anastrian had been replaced by Kale, that's. The heroic knight king on the saddle had been replaced by the mage hero, and the leadership had changed. It was no longer the elves, but the humans. This scene made countless elves feel conflicted and sad. Duque walked on the red carpet, looking around from the corner of his eyes. He had to admit that the main city of the High Elves was indeed beautiful. There were beautiful sculptures and buildings everywhere. Even if a piece of a building were to be dismantled by the roadside and auctioned in the human world, it could be sold for a sky-high price. It had to be known that this was not the Silvermoon City that had been witnessed by the players in the future, the one that had been built next to the original ruins. This was the original Silvery Moon City. In terms of artistic value, it completely surpassed the 9 streets of the new city. Although New Silver Moon City was also very beautiful, compared to this beautiful ancient city with thousands of years of history, New Silver Moon City was more like a clumsy imitation. At this moment, Prince Kale, who was beside Duque, said softly, "Silvermoon is beautiful, right? She is the pride and greatest spiritual sustenance of the High Elves. If possible, we don't want her to be affected by the flames of war." Duque noticed that the prince used she to describe Silvermoon City. Just like how humans like to use women's names to describe warships. This kind of attachment to things was really characteristic of the elves. Duque replied, "That's exactly why I'm here." Kale, nodded and didn't say anything else. Before the negotiations reached the moment of signing, unforeseen events could still occur. The prince thought silently, as long as Duque doesn't ask for too much. The sound of drums and trumpets, as well as the noise, faded away with the end of the half-hour-long welcome ceremony. However, even though Duque's young and mysterious figure had disappeared from the entrance of the Parliament Hall, not a single elf citizen left. It was as if they were waiting for the final judgment, for the results of the negotiations. Everyone knew that the arrogance of the elves had long since angered the 7 human kingdoms and the bronze-bearded dwarves of the Cosmodan kingdom. When the humans repeatedly asked for help, the Silvermoon Parliament had arrogantly ignored them. Now, it was the High Elves' turn to face extinction. Would the humans still be willing to lend a helping hand? None of the elves knew. In the dazzling and glorious hall, the 1,024 magic lamps arranged in all directions illuminated the hall as if it was daytime. Walking in it, one couldn't see a trace of shadow, giving people a majestic feeling as if they were walking in the temple of the sun god. The Sun King Anastrian Sunstrider, who was sitting on his throne above the 9 steps of stairs, finally stood up. He spread his arms, and his slightly aged majestic voice reverberated in the huge hall that was more than 10,000 square meters. "Welcome, the Grand Duke of Stormwind City, the Orc Killer, the hero of the humans, and the great guardian candidate, Your Excellency Duke Marcus." For a king to formally call out Duque's title as the most awesome was undoubtedly a huge concession. It must be known that this kind of high-hatted greeting, when uttered by a ceremonial officer, and when uttered by a king, have 2 completely different meanings. Duque didn't want to provoke the elves any further. He bowed slightly so that his head was in a straight line with his back. He didn't lower his head, but purely expressed his respect for his elders. "Thank you, Your Majesty, the Breaking Dawn Archmage, the terminator of the Troll War, and the great ruler of the elves, Sun King Anastrian Sunstrider." Duque's words made the high-ranking elves, who had been laughing dryly, calm down a little. "Your Excellency Marcus, May I ask if I'm talking to the Grand Duke of Stormwind City now? Or the Deputy Commander of the Rotterdam Alliance? The Sun King's words had a deeper meaning in politics. Previously, in order to avoid provoking Kuel Salis, Duque could only approach the border of the elves in the name of the Grand Duke and his private army. If the high-ranking elves turned a blind eye and let Duque enter, they would let Duque stab them in the back during the first or second battle between the elves and the tribes. Then, the elves would at most think of a way to compensate Duque, and then join the alliance. Then, the matter would be over. However, the Silvermoon Council would accuse Aurelia of having an affair with Duque, and forbid Duque from entering. Alright, now that the elves' main force had been defeated, and the new soldiers had yet to be trained, they were only willing to invite Duque when their country was on the brink of extinction. If Duque insisted on holding on to this point, the elves would naturally have to continue to compensate Duque, who was the Grand Duke, for the damage to his heart and so on. Of course, Duque could do that, but he would be at a disadvantage. A smile appeared on Duke's face as he raised his hand, and a very formal document appeared in the air in front of all of the elves with the power of the arcane technique. I, Duke Marcus, have officially obtained the absolute authorization of the Rotterdam Alliance. As the Deputy Commander of the Rotterdam Alliance, I am fully responsible for the negotiation of the Kingdom of Kuel Salis joining the alliance. On it are the seals of the Commander-in-Chief and the kings of the member countries. Duque's move caught the Sun King and the Silvermoon Council off guard. No one expected Duque to have such a huge influence in the alliance. He actually obtained the full support of the Commander-in-Chief and 8 kings in one night. At this moment, the 8 kings were fighting bloody battles against the Horde on all fronts in the world. How much trust did it take for so many crafty kings to agree to give up their power in such a short period of time? How great was Duque's prestige? All the elves gasped. At this moment, a herald suddenly ran in a hurry. Oh no, the tribes have broken through our regional magic defense, and they will attack the city at any time. Duque raised his hand, and suddenly, a flag flew out of his storage space and into Aurelia's hand. Take my flag and stick it on the city wall. Today, the chief of the tribes will naturally get lost. The elves' faces changed again. Retreat with one flag? Are you kidding me? Chapter 389. If someone else dared to do such a thing in front of a group of high-level elves, it would be enough to say that the High Elves were a superior race and a nation of etiquette if they didn't burn him to death with magic fire on the spot. At first, the reaction of all the elves was that it was ridiculous. In other words, the humans thought that Duque was showing off. Not just any show-off, but a show that was courting death. A war flag could force back a horde army of 100,000. Wasn't he afraid of being struck by lightning for showing off so much? Several counselors were about to mock him, but all of them swallowed their words. Why? The name of a human. The shadow of a tree. Even if every counselor didn't like Duque, no one dared to deny Duque's achievements. There were many elves living in the human world, and the impact of the war had already spread to every country and city on the Lordaeron continent. There were a lot of orc heads on display outside more than one town. Duque's achievements were real. What if Duque's reputation was really so terrible that he could scare away the orcs with just a war flag? The elven counselors had to swallow their words and wait for the development of the situation. Duque looked at Aurelia. Aurelia also stared at Duque. This beautiful and smart elven ranger general certainly knew what Duque wanted. Duque used his wisdom to foresee a shameless and despicable power struggle. He also foresaw that this power struggle at the cost of the lives of the High Elves was destined to break Aurelia's heart. However, he still did his best to accompany her in her efforts, waiting for that 1 in a million chance of the high-level elves' brilliance. She didn't wait for that elven hope. She made things so difficult for Duque, made Duque do so much, and now it was time for her to give Duque an answer. Was she willing to use her transfer as the price in exchange for Duque's help to the High Elves for the last time? She gently closed her eyes and pondered for 2 seconds. When Aurelia's beautiful eyes appeared in front of everyone again, they were no longer confused, but incomparably determined. Aurelia Windrunner's clear and melodious voice resounded in the hall. According to His Excellency Duke Marcus' request, I will unfurl this flag and raise it high. Then, I will ride on a chocobo and cross half of Silvery Moon to the top of the outer walls. I will plant this flag there and see how the horde will react. Who agrees and who objects? Her mellow voice was filled with determination. In fact, this was Aurelia's final, tearful accusation against the vermin of the country and the useless people in high positions. That's right. As long as any of you still have a bit of backbone, then step forward and use the elves' methods to solve the elves' crisis. If all of you are useless trash, then don't blame me for hiring an outsider. Who agreed? Who objected? She said it lightly, but no one dared to say anything. Everyone knew that if Duque succeeded, then Duque would become an undying legend in the history of Azeroth. At the same time, it would be a huge blow to the reputation of the Kuel Salis royal family and the parliament. But in a crisis like this where the army was pressing down on the city, one wrong word could mean the end of one's political career and even one's life. The counselors, who would speak eloquently in this hall almost every time, were all mute. After Aurelia finished speaking, she waited for a full 10 seconds. Her gaze swept from left to right, from top to bottom, back and forth between the counselors and the Sunstrider father and son. When she found that no one dared to meet her gaze, Aurelia's face revealed a sad but resolute smile. That means no one is against it. Then I'm leaving. I'm leaving. Not only did this mean that she would step out of the hall and run to the top of the city wall, it also meant that she, the Ranger General who had been loyal to Quell, the Lost for thousands of years, the heroine of the High Elves, would forever leave the people she once loved, her country, with disappointment and sorrow. Prince Kael, was deeply hurt by this scene. He almost instinctively raised his right hand, as if he wanted to ask Aurelia to stay, but he still put down his hand dejectedly. After seeing the prince's action, Aurelia opened her mouth slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but in the end, she didn't say a word. She turned around and walked away. Tisk. Illyria wasn't the only one. Servanas, who was also a ranger general, also turned around and left with her sister. However, what she left behind for the counselors was the back of her head, which was even more rebellious. Time in the hall seemed to freeze. No one spoke because everyone was waiting for the result. In the end, a shocking legend would be born. Or would it create a joke that would be laughed at for 10,000 years? Every high-ranking person was looking forward to it. Aurelia strode out of the hall, and her third and fourth sisters immediately came up to her. Let's go. A certain braggart claimed that he could scare off Orgrim with a flag. Let's go and see. Without hesitation, the 4 Windrunner sisters flew up to their mounts. Under the watchful eyes of the crowd, they unfurled Duque's huge blue storm emblem flag. Compared to Silvermoon City, which had red and gold as its base color, this refreshing blue was so out of place. It was so abrupt and glaring. Moreover, an elven ranger general was holding up a human noble's flag. What did this mean? The moment the flag fluttered in the wind, Aurelia truly received the attention of the crowd. Suspicion. Panic. Unease. Questioning. Complaints. Anger. Almost all the emotions gathered on Aurelia's face. Her arm was firm and strong, as if she had pulled a bow millions of times. Her body was as firm as a pine tree. She was not afraid of the rumors or the attacks of hostility. However, on her beautiful face, 2 drops of tears rolled down. Yes. These are the last 2 drops of tears that I, Aurelia Windrunner, shed for my beloved country. Through the long street. Through the square. Ignoring the bewildered citizens and the guards who tried to stop her, Aurelia finally arrived at the top of Silvermoon City's main gate. In her field of vision, a mixed army of tens of thousands of tribes and trolls had long been prepared to attack the city. Over 1,000 huge and crude catapults were lined up in a row. The orc laborers panted heavily, carrying heavy sandbags on their backs, ready to fill up all obstacles on the siege road, with sandbags or their corpses. The heavily armed orc warriors roared restlessly. And the even more cruel trolls continued to slaughter the elven captives before the battle began, carrying out the last blood sacrifice before the battle. However, when Aurelia rushed up to stand on the top of the city wall, she suddenly stirred up strong gusts of wind behind her, condensing the hurricane into a huge battle bow. After she shot out Duque's storm flag, half of the battlefield below fell silent. 500 meters away, the azure storm flag that was stuck in the ground fluttered in the wind. Every orc who saw this flag was in an uproar. There was no longer that fierce and unparalleled aura, but instead an indescribable panic. You're tuning in to the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.